Section 19 of the Partition of Europe by Philip Guedalla. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Book 2, Chapter 10, The French Republic, the Consulate, Part 1. The accident of a successful coup d'état provided France, in the late autumn of 1799, with the strongest government that it had known since the death of Louis XIV. The Consulate, which governed France for 4 years, passed through 3 phases, and in each of them it was profoundly representative of French opinion. In its first phase, it formed for 5 weeks a provisional government pending the elaboration of a new constitution, and gave clear expression to the national desire to abolish the system of the Directory. In its second phase, it conducted for 18 months a work of political and social reconstruction, which was a complete interpretation of the French temper of its time. The Consulate was now operating as the firm but constitutional executive of a republic. But as the system which it was erecting increased in popularity, and as it gradually became apparent that the sole guarantee of its continuance was the life of Bonaparte, the Consulate entered its third phase and became a personal government. The Consulate à vie was a republican monarchy, less constitutional than the government of England, and only less monarchical than the government of Prussia. But its work was an honest and vigorous attempt to secure to France by order and regulation the advantages which it had gained by the violent effort of the past 10 years. The Consulate codified the Revolution. It reduced the ideas of 1789 to a system of law, which it was prepared to impose by a rigid exercise of authority. It marked the end of the Revolution only as a dam marks the end of an area of reclaimed land to prevent a return of the sea. The Provisional Consulate was well received by its new subjects. Opposition in the provinces was crystallized in the protests of a few local politicians, and in Paris, whilst labour acquiesced without enthusiasm, the bourgeois were exultant at the prospect of a return to stable conditions, and the commercial classes expressed their growing confidence in a steady rise of stocks. The repeal of the new taxes and the Jacobin law of local hostages marked the end of the terrorist system of the later Directory. But the breach with the late government was not conspicuous before the promulgation of the new constitution. The Provisional Consulate was a directory of 3 from which the personal domination of Bonaparte was excluded by a rigid rotation of the presidency. But a quaint misconception of the political prospect was displayed by the Royalists, who regarded the coup d'état of Brumaire as the prelude of a monarchical restoration. It was a singular estimate of Bonaparte's disinterestedness, which saw him as a retiring subordinate of the Bourbons. The chief work of the Provisional Consulate was done in the 2 committees which were drafting the Constitution of 1800. 2 solutions were exhibited for their choice, the scheme of Seyss and the scheme of Donu, and it was the triumph of Bonaparte that by blending the 2, he appropriated to himself the results of the coup d'état and deprived Seyss of the benefit of his own work. The proposal of Seyss, which was designed to perpetuate in power the constitutional Jacobins, was strictly conservative. Executive power was to be exercised in his scheme by 2 councils, whilst elaborate precautions were taken to insulate legislation from democratic influence. Direct election was to be abolished, and in its place a legislature of 2 houses was to be appointed from a constituency of 5,000 notables. Supreme authority was given to a 3rd or uppermost house of 80 irresponsible and irremovable members, the jury constitutionnaire. This house was to nominate the members of the legislature from the Liste nationale de notabilité, to revise their legislation by its power of annulling all unconstitutional measures, and finally to control the executive by its election of the Grand Electeur, by whom the consuls were nominated. It was a complete scheme to ensure the supremacy of Seius and a Jacobin Senate. The proposal of Donu was more radical. It included an executive of 3 consuls and a legislature of 2 houses chosen by popular election. Bonaparte, who had little taste either for democracy or for the system of Seius, imposed a composite solution of his own. He was content to exclude popular influence by the retrograde system of liste de notabilité, from whom a Sénat conservateur nominated the deputies of the Tribunat and the Corps Législatif. But his real attention was directed to the organization of the executive. This power was to be exercised by 3 consuls, with the assistance of the Conseil d'État, an official committee of expert administrators. Among the consuls, supreme control was given to the first consul, who nominated all executive and judicial officers. Power was effectively transferred from Seius, the Grand Electeur, to Bonaparte, the first consul. It was the second and more successful coup d'etat. It remained to secure for the new system the national sanction of plebiscite. The Constitution of 1800, which was submitted to the French electorate, was more than a form of government. It was a political program, because by its terms it nominated to the consulate Bonaparte, Cambacérès, and Lebrun, and by the institution of the Consulat décennal it stereotyped this executive for 10 years. The provisional consulate had endeavoured to conciliate every considerable body of opinion. The demand for peace had been met by a period of negotiation with Great Britain and Austria. Religious feeling had been satisfied by a repeal of persecuting measures, and royalism had been considered in the pacification of the Vendée. It resulted that the Constitution of 1800 was adopted by a majority of 3 million. Less than 1 elector in 2000 had voted against it. The consular republic was definitely established, and it became the business of its administrators to ensure its continued existence. The note of authority, which had been struck in a decimation of the Parisian press, was sustained in a new system of local government. The domination of the central government was reproduced in the provinces by the institution of préfet, whose absolute control was at once a singular reminiscence of the royal intendants and the most significant indication of the temper of the new government. The consular republic had received its mandate. It proposed to govern France. Although European peace formed part of the program of the consular republic, it resulted from the survival of the Second Coalition that the consulate, in order to impose that peace upon continental Europe, continued the War of the Directory in the campaign of 1800. The military value of the monarchical alliance was largely reduced by the withdrawal of Russia from active cooperation. The erratic diplomacy of Paul I had been provoked by Bonaparte's Levantine policy into a decisive intervention in 1799. The Tsar now removed the immense weight of Russian support, and his motives were variously explained as disappointment at the defeats in Holland and Switzerland, irritation at British exactitude in the payment of subsidies, and annoyance at a lack of Austrian tact at Ancona and of British expedition at Portsmouth. It resulted from this withdrawal that the Continental War confronted France with the familiar problem of defeating Austria. The Austrian design projected an invasion of the Republic along 2 lines. One army, concentrated behind the Upper Rhine, was to pass that river and enter eastern France, whilst a second army forced the Alpine frontier and invaded Provence from northern Italy, with the cooperation of a British expedition directed from Minorca against the Mediterranean coast. The French proposed to meet this offensive by an immediate counter-offensive, and to strike at Vienna by the familiar routes of the Danube valley and the plain of northern Italy. In fulfilment of this design, the command of Moreau was concentrated in southern Alsace, and the command of Masséna maintained its defensive with difficulty in the maritime Alps. An army of reserve was massed at Dijon under Berthier, with the apparent object of intervening in either theatre of war. This force, whose earlier operations attracted little attention, became, under the direction of Bonaparte, the most prominent factor in the spring campaign, and transferred the decision from the valley of the Danube to the valley of the Po. The manoeuvre of Marengo was a Napoleonic variation on Carnot's plan. On the Italian front, the first results were strikingly unsatisfactory. The Austrian offensive drove Suchet behind the French frontier, isolated Masséna and Genoa, and reduced the Republican dominion in Italy to the besieged garrison of a single seaport. Some compensation was afforded by a French advance on the German front. Moreau passed the Rhine, turned the line of the Black Forest at its southern end, and fought his way toward the headwaters of the Danube. Meanwhile, the army of reserve moved unobtrusively toward the western passes of the Alps, and the first consul left Paris for the southeastern frontier. It was the design of Bonaparte to enter Italy from the northwest, and to place himself across the road to Vienna in the rear of the Austrians. He calculated that the defence of their own communications would recall them from the French frontier and bring them to action in Lombardy. He joined the army which passed the Alps in circumstances of some difficulty, and entered Piedmont. 4 weeks after his departure from Paris, the French marched into Milan. 2 days later, Genoa surrendered, and the Austrians were at liberty to turn eastward and clear the road to Vienna. After a preliminary contact at Montebello, they were completely defeated at Marengo in the last stages of a doubtful battle. June 14th, 1800. 24 hours later, the Austrians withdrew behind the Mincio by the armistice of Alessandria. The campaign of 1800 had cleared the plain of northern Italy as effectively as the campaign of 1796. It was the design of the first consul that Marengo should figure as the decisive engagement, and 4 weeks later the successful advance of Moreau by the line of the Danube was arrested by the armistice of Parsdorf. The interval which was afforded by the armistice was employed by Bonaparte in the reorganization of Italy. The Cisalpine Republic had been at once reconstituted in rear of the French fighting line, but the first consul contemplated the formation of a larger national unit. The organization of Italy was a work consistent with the nationalist temper of the Revolution, and attractive to Bonaparte himself. But it was imposed on the directors of French policy primarily as a military measure against Austria. A consulta of Italian notables met on French territory at Lyons, and began a series of constitutional debates, which was to end 13 months later in the proclamation of an Italian republic under the presidency of Bonaparte. His position in France itself was equally assisted by the campaign of Marengo. He had left Paris as a semi-civilian spectator of Berthier's command, but he returned from Italy with an admitted ascendancy. His official residence had been already transferred to the Tuileries, and his court began to acquire from the returning émigrés a more distinguished atmosphere than had been noticeable in the receptions of the earlier republic. His growing predominance attracted the displeasure of the more austere republicans, and his approach to monarchy was marked by the compliment of an attempt on his life. In the second phase of the campaign, which was resumed on the expiration of the armistice, the decision was transferred to the valley of the Danube, and operations in Italy were reduced to a position of secondary importance. Murat completed the French dominion in Italy by an uncontested excursion through the southern provinces, whilst Brune, whose ultimate objective was the eastern passes of the Alps, conducted an active campaign among the fortresses of the Venetian quadrilateral, at the close of which the Austrians withdrew behind the Tagliamento. The movements of Moreau were more decisive. The French advance through eastern Bavaria was uninterrupted until the ill-conceived offensive of the Archduke John involved the Austrians in complete defeat at Hohenlinden. A rapid movement brought Moreau in 3 weeks within 90 miles of Vienna, and his advance was only arrested halfway on the road from the Bavarian frontier to the capital by the conclusion of the armistice of Steyr. The defeat of Austria enabled French diplomacy to impose peace upon the continent of Europe. Negotiations were opened in Lorraine between Cobenzl and Joseph Bonaparte, and in the Peace of Lunéville the directors of Austrian policy acquiesced in a blend of the tradition of the Revolution and the personal policy of the first consul. This settlement was in substance a reenactment of the Peace of Campo Formio. The Habsburg monarchy acquiesced in the French system of subordinate republics. The Consulate judiciously withdrew the unfortunate experiments which had been made in Naples and Rome, and substituted as candidates for European recognition the more creditable governments established in Holland and Switzerland, whilst Tuscany was promoted from a duchy to a kingdom and passed from a Habsburg to a Spanish Bourbon. In Central Europe, the revolutionary principle of secularization was adopted as a means for providing compensations for the German princes. This decision, which led directly to the absorption in larger units of the fragmentary and diminutive territories of the Church, assisted to that extent the possibility of German unity. The simplification of German political geography and the erasure of a mazy network of internal frontiers formed the essential prelude to any project of national organization. So long as Germany was a mosaic, it would never be a nation. In its results, the War of the Second Coalition ended with the triumph of the Republic. It was significant of the French victory that the settlement of Lunéville imposed the French solution of every European problem which was raised in it. In the trace of its frontiers, it accepted the doctrine of natural limits and adopted the Rhine frontier for France. In its treatment of Germany, it accepted the revolutionary specific of secularization and preserved Central Europe as an ideal field for French intervention. And in its organization of Italy, it sanctioned the national solution within the limits of the Adige frontier, and elevated to the dignity of a European settlement the results of Bonaparte's Italian campaigns. The Second Coalition had ceased to exist, and in its place a position of continental predominance was occupied by the Consular Republic within the limits of its natural frontiers, behind the system of its subordinate governments, and under the direction of its first consul. End of section 19. Section 20 of the Partition of Europe by Philip Guedalla. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Book 2, Chapter 10, The French Republic, the Consulate, Part 2. The foremost problem which confronted the Consulate in its own country was the reconciliation of the Republic to the Church. The anti-clericalism of the Revolution, although it was inherent in the origins of that movement, had been, by the creation of national divisions, a source of political weakness. It was the ambition of the Consulate to render the results of the Revolution acceptable to all Frenchmen, and from those results it was essential, if France was to be reunited, to erase the provocative religious policy which had been originated in 1791. The Consulate had imposed peace on Europe. it remained to give peace to France. The resolve of Bonaparte became obvious during the campaign of Marengo. A declaration to the clergy of Milan revealed his conviction that religion was a necessity to the state, and the condition of France demonstrated that the revolution must ally itself with the religion of the majority, since it had failed to destroy it. This policy of reconciliation was threatened on two sides by the unyielding temper of the Church and the anti-religious orthodoxy of the mass of republicans. But it survived a period of precarious negotiation and resulted in the signature and promulgation of the Concordat. In the preamble of this document, the Republic conceded that the Catholic religion was that of the consuls and of the great majority of the French people. In its text, the government granted freedom of public worship within the limits imposed by exigencies of police, and received in return two great concessions. The bishops were to resign for reappointment on the presentation of the Republic, and the land system of France, which rested on the revolutionary sales of church property, was fortified by a papal assurance that the revolution had made a good title. It was the mission of the Consulate to make peace, although it was a government imposed by a military coup and directed by a successful general. Its European exertions in this direction had produced the Peace of Lunéville. Its ecclesiastical diplomacy had concluded the Concordat, and its determination to maintain the repose of France was expressed in its conduct of French politics. The Republic, with the fall of the Directory, had ceased to be parliamentary and had become administrative. The Consulate, as an executive, had absorbed all the functions of the state. It was significant of this tendency that the supreme work of French legislation, the codification of the law, was undertaken not by a committee of the legislature, but by the nominated Conseil d'État, sitting under the direction of the first consul. Public discussion was regarded as a disturbing and Jacobin practice, and parliamentary politicians were profoundly unpopular in the country. It resulted that the eloquence of the tribunat appeared to be as unprofitable an interference with the executive as the epigrams of Madame de Staël's salon. The existence of an opposition was not easy to justify when the country did not contemplate a change of government. Formal homage had been done to academic republicanism in the state mourning for Washington, but the rapid revival of Parisian life was hardly consistent with the rigid practices of republican austerity. The criticism of official measures was increasingly resented, and when the disturbing reputation of the Jacobins was revived by an attempt on the first consul's life, the opportunity was seized for a wholesale proscription and deportation of republican politicians, and the establishment of provincial courts-martial. It was the paradox of the consular republic that it was a republic without republicans, and circumstances were soon to substitute a more logical government. In the whole course of this successful and authoritative administration, the fact of Bonaparte's predominance became increasingly impressed upon the French electorate. It had observed the campaign of Marengo. It had seen the Concordat imposed upon the Republic, and it had indicated by its alarm at the Jacobin plots the value which it set upon Bonaparte's life. Gradually it realized that the Consulate was inconceivable without the first consul, and with the growth of this realization, the consular republic became a personal government. The ascendancy of Bonaparte was conspicuously indicated by his elevation at Lyons to the Italian presidency, and on his return from the Consulta, his influence was equal to a striking violation of French parliamentary government. By an indication made through the Senate of the members who were eligible for re-election to the Corps Législatif, he decimated the opposition. The conclusion of the Peace of Amiens in 1802 added still further to the strength of his position. The reputation of the first consul had grown too great for the limits imposed upon it by the Constitution of 1800, and it became desirable to convert his authority into a permanent presidency. The Senate declined to do more than extend his term of office for a further 10 years. But on the proposal of the official Conseil d'État, it was resolved to submit the question to the people. A plebiscite was taken, which resulted in a majority of nearly 3.5 millions in favor of the Consulat à vie. By this vote, the consular republic became a republican monarchy. The change was in no sense a military effort, as the coup d'état of Brumaire had been, because the votes of the republican minority were largely the votes of soldiers. The republicanism of the army had survived the republic, and Bonaparte received his majority from the voting of 3 groups: from the royalists in acknowledgment of the amnesty, from the clergy in endorsement of the Concordat, and from the bulk of Frenchmen in gratitude for the peace. The European war was reduced by the Peace of Lunéville to the war of France against England. The conclusion of that peace affected the position of Great Britain only in so far as the detachment of the last of her allies isolated her government and excluded her armies from operations on the continent. The military effort of the Republic, which had imposed peace upon continental Europe, was far less successful in its treatment of the maritime and transmarine problems of the war against England, and the English War of the Consulate formed an instructive prelude to the more decisive failure of the Empire. It was a central feature of that war that England exercised without serious interruption her maritime supremacy. By the destruction of all hostile battle fleets, she had secured the command of the sea in the first 4 years of the war, and that command was now expressed in 3 forms: the occupation of French colonies, the blockade of French ports, and the destruction of French commerce. The French reply was an attempted exclusion of British commerce from the continent of Europe. By a system of treaties, the Consulate closed the ports of Spain and Italy to English shipping, and in a negotiation with the United States, French diplomacy attempted to extend the commercial war to a still wider area. A decisive protest against British enforcement of the rights of blockade and seizure of contraband goods was made by Russia under French direction. The diplomacy of Paul I was deflected by the first consul toward the French alliance, and the Tsar headed an armed neutrality of the North to exclude British sea power from the Baltic in the interests of neutral shipping by the combination of Russia, Prussia, Denmark, and Sweden. This challenge was immediately accepted by Great Britain. The commercial warfare, in which the Consulate had sought an easy substitute for naval battles, imposed upon England the necessity of blockading the coasts of Europe from Toronto to the Texel. And if that blockade was to be effective, British warships must retain the right to intercept contraband when carried in neutral ships. A fleet proceeded to the Baltic to coerce the neutrals, and their league, which barely survived the murder of Paul I, collapsed 9 days later, after Nelson's bombardment of Copenhagen, April 2, 1801. It was the most decisive expression that British sea power had yet received. The English were not less successful in the Mediterranean, where British forces were actively engaged in effacing all traces of Bonaparte's expedition to Egypt. That enterprise had achieved 2 results. It had captured Malta, and it had deposited a French army of occupation on the lower Nile. The presence of French garrisons in Malta and North Africa was regarded as a serious menace to England's control of the Mediterranean, and British energies were directed toward their removal. Malta had been captured from the French after a siege in the previous year, and the English, who appreciated its value as a naval position, remained in occupation of the island. A more serious problem was presented by the army of Egypt on the Nile. This force, which had been completely isolated from France since the destruction of its communications in the Battle of the Nile, illustrated by its position the futility of an overseas expedition undertaken without command of the sea. In the previous year Kléber had offered to evacuate Egypt, but the British insisted on the surrender of his army. Hostilities continued, and he was able to maintain a successful defensive against the Turks until his murder. Menou, who succeeded him in the command, masqueraded as an Egyptian and endeavoured to perpetuate the French occupation, but his position was threatened by a triple offensive. Whilst a Turkish army moved through Syria, and a body of Indian troops was directed towards Egypt by the Red Sea, a British force effected a landing on the northern coast and moved towards Cairo. The city surrendered after a siege, and the area of French occupation was reduced to the position of Menou in Alexandria. 4 weeks later Alexandria fell, and the French occupation was at an end. The army of Egypt returned to France in British transports. With this triumph of British sea power, the war began to lose all meaning. The Republic had little interest in prolonging a duel in which it could bring no effective weapon to bear on England's maritime supremacy, and British enthusiasm was reduced by the fact that without allies England could exercise no pressure upon a continental power. The prospect of peace was increased by the circumstance that Addington had succeeded Pitt in office after Pitt's Irish policy had encountered the immovable obstacle of the king's conscience. The minister who had conducted the war for 8 years resigned early in the year 1801, because George III was unable to reconcile his coronation oath with an emancipation of the Irish Catholics. Negotiations were opened between the two powers, and the last phase of the war was merely a manoeuvre of French diplomacy. The first consul endeavoured to raise the price of peace by a spectacular threat of invasion. A considerable army was concentrated at the camp of Boulogne, and a flotilla of transports was gathered in the northern ports. The momentary success of a French fleet in the Mediterranean served to emphasize the menace, and Great Britain accepted the preliminaries of London, embodied 6 months later in the Peace of Amiens. The settlement which the first consul imposed upon England was in appearance strikingly favourable to France. After a war of 8 years against the system of the Revolution, Great Britain acquiesced in the establishment of that system on the continent of Europe, and consented to abandon all intervention in the affairs of Germany, Italy, Holland, and Switzerland. Pitt had made war in 1793 for the exclusion of France from the Low Countries. Addington made peace in 1802 by the exclusion of England from the Low Countries. End of section 20. Section 21 of the Partition of Europe by Philip Guedalla. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Book 2, Chapter 10, The French Republic, the Consulate, Part 3. In a maritime war in which her fleets had been uniformly successful, England made no colonial gain except Ceylon and Trinidad, and it was significant that even these acquisitions were made at the expense not of the Republic, but of its allies. The Consulate, which had fought an unsuccessful naval war, emerged from it without a substantial cession of French territory, and the continental supremacy of France was emphasized by the exclusion of England from Europe. But in one direction, French enterprise was checked by the settlement. The Egyptian experiment of Bonaparte was undone by a treaty which imposed the restoration of Egypt to Turkey and the erection of the Ionian Islands into a republic under Russo-Turkish protection postponed his Levantine ambitions. But even in the Mediterranean, Great Britain was not permitted to follow up her victory with an annexation. The question of Malta, which had been the most delicate problem of the negotiation, was decided against her, and Addington consented to withdraw the British garrison and restore the island to the Knights of St. John. The Peace of Amiens formed a remarkable termination for a war in which England had suffered no substantial reverse. The Consular Republic was predominant on the continent, and that predominance was properly expressed in the Peace of Lunéville, but there had been nothing in its conduct of the war against England to warrant the terms of the settlement of Amiens. It was the weakness of that settlement, by which an undefeated government was pledged to a policy of non-intervention in Europe, without the compensation of colonial gains, that it represented so little of the reality. The system of Amiens, which appeared so favourable to France, could not be lasting unless it conformed more closely with the facts of the European situation. The proclamation of peace was followed after a short interval by the establishment of the Consulate à vie. The Consular Republic was converted by plebiscite into the monarchy of the First Consul, and his advisers perpetuated the change in the Constitution of 1802. This document, which was the first monarchical system since the Constitution of 1791, was dictated by Bonaparte to his secretary. By its terms, the First Consul was permitted to nominate his successor. Bonaparte was at liberty to found a dynasty. He was endowed with a privy council and became president of the Senate, whose members he was to nominate. By the reduction in strength of the tribunat, the small parliamentary element in the constitution was compressed to vanishing point, and the substitution of a system of qualified election for the liste de notabilité formed an exiguous concession to democracy. The tone of the Tuileries became increasingly monarchical, and the First Consul adopted for official use the more dynastic title of Napoleon Bonaparte. His birthday became a national holiday, and his civil list rose from 500,000 to 6 million francs. The Consular Republic had produced a monarch. It remained only to provide itself with an order of nobility. This need was met by Bonaparte's institution of the Legion of Honour, and the republican monarchy was complete. In home policy there was no breach between the Consulat à vie and the earlier Consulate. The Conseil d'État proceeded with its work of codification, and the religious settlement was completed by the Article Organique. This document, which was promulgated with the Concordat, was a more Gallican interpretation of the settlement than was acceptable to the papacy, and the restrictions which it imposed on papal legislation, church councils, and ecclesiastical appeals drew a protest from the Pope. A second group of Articles Organiques regulated the position of Protestants under the French state, on lines similar to those which were afterwards adopted by the Empire in dealing with the Jews. Bonaparte had no sympathy with the anti-religious bigotry of the Jacobins, but he was not prepared to admit a sovereign church to the Republic. Any church was at liberty to enter its territory, but it entered it as the subordinate of its government. The diplomacy of the Consulate was directed towards fortifying the European system of the Revolution. That system was composed of two elements: the policy of annexation and the policy of subordinate governments, of which only the latter was an innovation. The Revolution had inherited from the tradition of the French monarchy the habit of extending French territory by annexation. The annexations were confined at this stage to regions possessing a strategical value, and the adoption of the new doctrine of natural frontiers sufficed to give a modern air to the proceeding. But they represented the survival in French policy of the method by which the monarchy had constructed the eastern frontier. To this system, which was traditional, the Directory had added a second, which was more characteristic of the Revolution. The addition was made when the directors of French policy began to surround France with a belt of dependencies. The minor republics of Holland and Italy, which received their constitutions from Paris and followed respectfully in the train of French policy, represented a new element in Europe and contributed in a large degree to the continental predominance of the Republic. The system of subordinate governments received a wide extension from the diplomacy of the First Consul and became the foundation of the European system of the Empire. It was consistent with this policy that Bonaparte reconstructed the Dutch Republic with a consular constitution, and controlled Italy by the governments which he had established in 1796. A more original move was the annexation of Piedmont, which ensured French control of the western passes of the Alps and admitted French troops to the Italian plain without the formality of passing a frontier. Military motives dictated equally the creation of the subordinate Republic of the Valais. This government, which was without political significance, owed its existence to the fact that it held the road between the valleys of the Rhone and the Po, and its establishment, together with the Piedmontese annexation, completed the First Consul's diplomatic preparation for the next Italian campaign. His policy was next directed towards Central Europe. The importance of Switzerland, both for offensive and defensive purposes, had been indicated by every campaign since 1798, and the control of that territory was a natural object of French ambition. A concentration of French troops on the Swiss frontier was followed by their violation of Swiss territory. Bonaparte intervened in Swiss politics under the pretext of mediation, and in the resulting settlement French control was ensured. At the same time, French diplomacy presided over the reconstruction of Germany. Whilst the Diet adopted a system of secularization and became an echo of the Revolution, the complex of German politics was immensely simplified by the northern preponderance of Prussia and the southern preponderance of Bavaria. This rapid extension of French influence was gravely alarming to Great Britain, but a second development of Bonaparte's policy was still more disturbing. The Consulate appeared about to rescue the Transmarine Empire, which Louis XV had lost, and revived with apparent sincerity the Bourbon colonial policy. The acquisition of Louisiana from the Spanish government had opened to French enterprise the increasing trade of the Mississippi. The island of San Domingo presented an admirable field for the exploitation of Negro industry, and an expedition left Brest for Pondicherry, with instructions modelled on the achievement of Dupleix. In the result, Bonaparte's colonial experiment was completely unsuccessful. Louisiana failed and was sold to the United States. Leclerc led the army of Egypt to die of fever in San Domingo, and Descamps withdrew from India to the Mauritius. But despite their eventual failure, the colonial enterprises of the Consulate were profoundly disturbing to Englishmen and exercised a serious influence on the course of British policy. Minor provocations resulted from the truculence of the British press and the extension of English hospitality to French political exiles. The exclusion of British trade from the ports of France, Holland, and Italy indicated a resumption of commercial warfare. But the situation which finally put upon the system of Amiens a decisive strain resulted from a more familiar cause. The Egyptian expedition, in which Bonaparte had expressed a determination to disturb the Mediterranean status quo, had occasioned genuine alarm in England, and as it became apparent from the later developments of his policy that the First Consul had abandoned none of his Levantine ambitions, the temper of Great Britain became profoundly suspicious, and the government grew less willing to expose Malta to a French attack by withdrawing the British garrison in accordance with the terms of peace. The selection of General Sebastiani for a commercial mission in the eastern Mediterranean did little to reassure English opinion. The investigations of a staff officer were not likely to be confined to pure economics, and the publication of his report on the ports and strong places of Egypt and Syria hardened the British determination to retain Malta at all costs. The continent rang with Bonaparte's denunciation of English duplicity, and the ambassador in Paris was treated to a spectacular display of temper. The directors of English policy violated the system of Amiens by a determination to retain Malta and a frank refusal to be bound by the promise of non-intervention in Europe. 6 weeks later, a British ultimatum demanded the evacuation of Holland, Switzerland, and Piedmont, and the declaration of war terminated the Peace of Amiens. Official hostilities were preceded by a general seizure of French shipping and English travellers, and the two powers entered on a war of 11 years, whose course was to supply the history of the empire with an uninterrupted background. The internal policy of the Consulate followed a normal course. The personal government of Bonaparte was emphasized by a vigorous display of executive authority. Genuine republicanism was almost extinct outside the army, and in the absence of any parliamentary life, opposition was crystallized in a single salon. The suppression of a few military conspiracies and the banishment of Madame de Staël left the first consul at liberty to proceed with the work of reconstruction. The Code Civil emerged from the Conseil d'État and was rapidly passed through the legislature. A body of statute law containing more than 2,000 articles was adopted in 12 months, and in 1804 France was provided with the orderly edifice of the Code Napoleon. It was the most lasting result of the Revolution. During the same months, a distraction was provided by a more serious menace to the government than had yet been seen. It was offered by a combination of military republicanism and Breton royalism, directed by Moreau, Pichegru, and Georges Cadoudal. The plot was observed and suppressed. But Bonaparte took an almost purposeless revenge on the Bourbons in the arrest and execution of the Duc d'Enghien. This prince, who was resident in Baden, was not implicated in the conspiracy, but a detachment of French cavalry violated the frontier, and he was seized, court-martialed, and shot at Vincennes. It was a lesson to militant royalists. The conspiracies against the life of the first consul served to emphasize his preeminence, and the development of the consular monarchy proceeded without interruption. A motion in the tribunal proposed the establishment of the empire, and the proposal was debated in the Senate. Only one member spoke against it. It was Carnot, who had defended the Republic too often to vote its abolition. The Conseil d'État drafted a new constitution, and the decree was promulgated. The empire had begun. 6 months later, in the Cathedral of Notre Dame and in the presence of the Pope, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French. It was the last and most singular act of the Revolution. End of section 21. Section 22 of the Partition of Europe by Philip Guedalla. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Book 3, The Empire, Chapter 11, The Early Empire, Part 1. The establishment of the French Empire was an event of European importance. It was the last phase of the Revolution. When the exigencies of French politics substituted a military monarchy for a monarchical republic, there was no breach with the history of the past decade. The revolution was crystallized in the empire, and the emperor was a general of the republic. Napoleon imposed the revolution upon Europe, and it is the importance of the empire that under his direction that movement, which, with the single exception of its Italian province, had made little progress beyond the natural frontiers of France, was extended over the whole continent. The Empire was not an interruption, but an extension of the Revolution, and the Emperor conducted in his first 3 campaigns a continuation of the war which Louis XVI had declared in 1792. Until the Peace of Tilsit, the monarchies of Europe were united against France by a common hostility to the Revolution. It was not until a later stage, when the Emperor's policy no longer coincided with the purpose of the Revolution, that they were united against France by a common hostility to Napoleon. But although his conquest of Central and Southwestern Europe was the expression of a personal ambition, the imperfection of its motive cannot detract from the magnitude of its value. If Italy was to become a nation, or Germany a unit, those developments were arrested in the presence of a feudal society, a medieval jurisprudence, and an intricate political geography. There was only one force in Europe which could destroy the barriers of traditional systems and eliminate the network of internal frontiers, and that force could only enter a foreign country behind the bayonets of French troops. In the temporary national effacement of a French occupation, the power of the Revolution did its work of preparing the way for the national unity by the inspiration contained in its ideas and the simplification effected by its measures. Administrative unity was the prelude to national unity. Intellectual liberty was the prelude to national liberty, and in the logical solutions of the Revolution were found a guide towards the logical solutions of nationality. It was the highest form of political education to be a French province, and it is immaterial to Europe that the extension of the French frontiers afforded also a private satisfaction to Napoleon and a national glory to France. The Empire, which was the personal predominance of Napoleon and the military predominance of France, was an incident in the history of the Revolution. It was the Revolution in its European aspect. This continuity of the Empire with the consular republic was emphasized in institutions of the new system. The name of republic was retained in spite of the creation of an emperor, and the powers of the emperor were defined by an extension of those of the first consul. In effect, the head of a republican executive became the founder of an imperial dynasty. His brothers became princes, his generals were promoted marshals of France, and his familiar officials composed, with the assistance of a dignified terminology, a court, as an ornament of which the emperor was at times worse than provincial. His powers of appointment were largely extended, his control of foreign policy was absolute, and his administrative supremacy was ensured by a vast power of prerogative legislation. After 15 years of revolution, the legislative centre of France was transferred to the room where Napoleon dictated his decrees. The establishment of personal government was complete. When the Empire succeeded to the Consulate, it inherited the international situation which had been created by its predecessor, and for the last 12 months of its existence the Republic had conducted a war against England. That war, which lasted as long as the Empire, was a constant factor in Napoleon's calculations, and the variation of its phases changed the direction of his policy. It was possible for the French power to exercise effective pressure upon Great Britain in 3 ways: by the suppression of British trade, the capture of British colonies, and the invasion of England. Of those ways, the first alone was practicable so long as the power of France remained purely continental. It was open to a military power so to control the mainland of Europe that British commerce was excluded from its ports. But since the coasts and colonies of Great Britain were accessible only by sea, it followed that England was immune from invasion or colonial attack until Napoleon could secure a maritime victory in the French favour. If it resulted from such a victory that a French fleet controlled the English Channel for 24 hours, or French cruisers could keep the North Atlantic for a month, the invasion of England or the occupation of the British West Indies would become a possibility. In the first phase of the war, it was the object of Napoleon's effort to secure that victory, and when after an endeavour of 2 years that effort failed, he was confined for the remainder of the war to the ineffective exclusion of British commerce from Europe and the desultory destruction of British merchantmen at sea. When in 1803 the war opened, the French effort developed against Great Britain along each of the 3 lines of attack. The colonial attack had been begun during the preceding period of strained relations by the dispatch of a considerable force to Indian waters. The West Indian islands were threatened by the presence of a strong French fleet, and the Levantine diversion by which Napoleon threatened Egypt and British India was effected by his occupation of Brindisi and Taranto, and an attempt to secure control of the Adriatic by the seizure of Cattaro. Equally elaborate was the attack on British trade. The importation or sale of British goods was prohibited throughout France, and by the occupation of Hanover, the area of exclusion was still further extended. When the French troops passed the Hanoverian frontier, their mission was more valuable than a mere seizure of the continental territory of the English crown. British commerce was prevented from passing into the neutral markets of Central Europe through the great ports of Hamburg and Bremen, and where British opinion might have regarded with equanimity the sacrifice of an unpopular German electorate, it observed with disgust the closing of the Elbe and the Weser to British trade. But the central object of the French effort was the invasion of England itself. A defended coastline was created between Cap Gris-Nez and the Somme. 5 army corps were moved into position behind it, and a flotilla of transports was hastily constructed. This immense war harbour was flanked by outlying positions on the Dutch coast and at Brest, and the whole was controlled by Napoleon from the principal station of Boulogne. It has been thought that the concentration in Picardy was a feint, but that he feinted against England for 2 years with 100,000 men and 1,300 ships is unlikely, if only because it was a feint which covered no real movement elsewhere. In its first phase, his design contemplated a passage of the Channel by transports without escort. They were armed with defensive artillery, but their construction rendered them completely unsuitable for manoeuvre at sea, and his misconception is only explicable by the fact that he was more familiar with the less exacting conditions of the Mediterranean. The difficulties experienced by the units of the flotilla in proceeding from their ports of construction to the point of concentration, and their complete inability to face the British cruisers without the support of their coast defences, demonstrated the futility of committing them without escort to the English Channel, and the design of invasion entered a second and less precarious phase. It now became the problem of French strategy to provide the transports with a sea-going escort of battleships, and since every unit of the French line was blockaded in harbour by a detachment of the English fleet, it became necessary to break the British blockade. The method of blockade had been adopted by the Admiralty as the most judicious form of maritime defence. Nelson maintained the Mediterranean blockade against Toulon. Cornwallis observed Brest, and a similar watch was kept over the minor ports of the Biscayan and Spanish coasts, with the result that England enjoyed complete security from naval attack. At this stage, 12 months after the declaration of war, and on the day that Napoleon became Emperor of the French, Pitt was recalled to office by a national demand. May 18th, 1804. The southern counties were genuinely alarmed at the prospect of invasion, and although there was no temper of depression comparable to the despair occasioned by the naval mutinies and financial crisis of 1797, it was felt that the situation required a more adequate minister than Addington. Pitt resumed office with a government of subordinates, and British policy returned at once to the familiar diplomacy of subsidies and coalitions. England, for the moment, was without an ally on the continent, while France enjoyed the hesitating support of Spanish finance and the valuable hospitality of Spanish harbours. The drift of Russia towards the English alliance, which had begun when the occupation of Hanover damaged a Russian market and the execution of the Duc d'Enghien shocked the Tsar, became more pronounced as the occupation of points in the eastern Mediterranean threatened a field of Russian activity. The Tsar proposed a basis of settlement which was rejected by Napoleon, and when the French forces were increased by the Spanish declaration of war, the course of Russian policy made certain the formation of the Third Coalition. The project of invasion now appeared in its final form and was completely unsuccessful. It was proposed that the command of Villeneuve should break out of Toulon, elude its pursuers in the West Indies, double back to Europe, and raise the blockade of Brest. The combined fleets would then control the eastern channel and provide the requisite escort for the transports. The plan failed for 3 reasons. Its mathematical precision was too soldierly to succeed at sea. It was indifferently executed, and the Emperor was distracted from its object by the development of the European situation. In the spring, Villeneuve duly broke the blockade and sailed westward for Gibraltar, whilst Nelson searched for his command in Egyptian waters. The French passed the straits and picked up a Spanish squadron at Cadiz. 48 hours later, an alliance was concluded between Russia and England. Whilst Nelson patrolled the eastern Mediterranean, Villeneuve secured a 4-week start in the race to the West Indies, which was reduced by Nelson's rapid pursuit to an advantage of 20 days. The French on their return voyage were overhauled by a British cruiser, which warned the Admiralty, and when Villeneuve attempted to approach the western mouth of the Channel, he was met and defeated by Calder off Cape Finisterre. But the Emperor's attention was distracted during the summer from the North Atlantic to his eastern frontier by the unfriendly development of Austrian policy. The extension of the French monarchy to Italy by the coronation of Napoleon at Milan was a step which Austria, as an Italian power, could not afford to ignore. And when this move was followed by a series of annexations in northern Italy, the Austrian tendency of Venetia became precarious, and Austrian diplomacy turned towards the Anglo-Russian alliance. Whilst Villeneuve moved dubiously from Vigo to Corunna, and from Corunna to Cadiz, Austria joined the Third Coalition, August 9th, 1805. 4 days later, the Emperor dictated an order moving the army of England into Central Europe, and the movements of his fleet became irrelevant to the main issue. 6 days after Villeneuve entered Cadiz, the cavalry left Boulogne, and the invasion of England was abandoned. An epilogue to the failure was provided by his complete defeat at sea. Nelson appeared in Spanish waters and found Villeneuve off Cape Trafalgar. It was the last effort of the Imperial Navy. October 21st, 1805. The creation of the Third Coalition had provided France with a less insuperable obstacle than the sea power of Great Britain, and the Emperor turned with relief to the familiar problem of defeating Austria. When the army of England left the hills of the Boulonnais, it became the most victorious fighting force that Europe had yet seen. In 2 years it advanced the frontier of French control from the Rhine to the Niemen, and its commander brought Europe more nearly within a universal empire than it had been for 1,000 years. In the march of the French armies from Boulogne to Austerlitz, and from Austerlitz to Jena, the supreme power of Napoleon found its fullest expression, and by the elimination of frontiers, which followed his victories, he prepared his reconstruction of Europe. It was desirable, before the Grand Army was committed to the march against Austria, to ascertain the attitude of Russia, and the Emperor's diplomacy occupied the summer with this inquiry. An offer of Hanover was designed to involve Frederick William III in war with George III, but it was impossible to entice him beyond neutrality, and the Emperor's league against Austria was confined to the minor monarchs of South Germany. Bavaria, Baden, Württemberg, and Hesse-Darmstadt were drawn to the French side by the hope of gain, and with this support and the assurance of Prussian neutrality, the French armies passed the Rhine. There was opposed to them an Austrian force which stood in Bavarian territory at Ulm, in order to receive the French offensive on the upper Danube as it emerged from the Black Forest, and to cover the concentration of the Austro-Russian armies in rear of it. The Emperor passed to the north of it and moved 200,000 men in 16 days into the angle of the Rhine and the Main between Strasbourg and Würzburg. The French armies then wheeled to the south on a front of 120 miles, until they lay from Munich to the Danube across the road from Ulm to Vienna. In 3 engagements, the command of Mack attempted to break out of Ulm without success, and 42 days after they had passed the Bavarian frontier, 15,000 Austrian troops surrendered to the French, October 20th. The destruction of the Third Coalition occupied the Emperor for a further 43 days. Moving rapidly along the middle Danube, he entered Vienna within 3 weeks of the surrender of Ulm, and turned northwards into Moravia to deal with the combined Austro-Russian armies. His position in occupation of the enemy's capital was dignified but precarious. His armies on the Danube lay between the command of the Tsar in Moravia and that of the Archdukes Charles and John in the eastern Alps on the road from Italy, and an intelligent cooperation might have destroyed him. The Emperor proposed to remove this possibility by annihilating the northern force, whilst the southern was diverted into Hungary. He moved into Moravia, and on a misty morning in winter he stood at Austerlitz to receive the attack of the 2 emperors. It was the first anniversary of his coronation, December 2nd, 1805. The Russian offensive was as ill conceived as Napoleon wished. Directed vigorously against the French right, it denuded the Allied centre of troops, and when the Emperor launched his attack into the gap, the Austro-Russian army ceased to exist. It was the end of the Third Coalition. The defeat of Austria was complete, and it was acknowledged by the terms of the Peace of Pressburg, December 26th. This treaty, which was negotiated by Talleyrand on the Hungarian frontier, was the first step in the Napoleonic reconstruction of Central Europe. The territory of Bavaria was doubled by the acquisition of Austria's Alpine dominions in Tyrol and the Vorarlberg. Baden and Württemberg divided the outlying Austrian possessions of Swabia, Constance, and Breisgau, and Austria received in return the infinitesimal compensation of Salzburg. France was confirmed in the North Italian annexations of the previous year, and the Kingdom of Italy became the predominant power on the Adriatic by the acquisition of Venetia, Istria, and Dalmatia. The Austrian power was reduced within the narrowest limits. In Germany, it was confronted with the advancing frontiers of the minor states. In Italy, it had ceased to possess a single mile of territory, and in the Balkan Peninsula, its expansion was threatened by the presence of French outposts on the Adriatic. France herself received no material gain in this settlement, but in its place she had a prospect of European predominance such as she had never before enjoyed. the emperor now turned to Prussia, which had observed the destruction of Austria in a condition of paralyzed neutrality. A mobilization of Prussian troops during the campaign of Austerlitz had threatened Napoleon in Moravia, and appeared to indicate a termination of the king's indecision. But the ambassador who was sent from Berlin to threaten the emperor with Prussian intervention was induced to postpone his business till the decisive engagement, and the result of Austerlitz led him to substitute an unheroic message of congratulation for a movement of troops which might have reversed and would undoubtedly have modified the decision of the campaign. The emperor, who appreciated the danger in which he had been placed, was indisposed to forgive the government which was responsible for it, and he somewhat unkindly availed himself of the presence of a Prussian envoy to negotiate a treaty which was singularly unfavourable to Prussia. By the Treaty of Schönbrunn, signed 11 days before the Peace of Pressburg, Prussia was forced into the new system of Napoleonic Germany. She entered it with the surrender of her Rhenish and other minor territories in exchange for the most unwelcome gift of Hanover, which carried with it the certainty of war with England, and it remained to be seen whether Prussian docility would tolerate in North Germany a position similar to that occupied south of the Main by Bavaria. End of section 22. Section 23 of the Partition of Europe by Philip Guedalla. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Book 3, Chapter 11. The Early Empire, Part 2. Having destroyed the Third Coalition, the Emperor set rapidly about the reconstruction of Europe, whilst Pitt died in the ruins of his last coalition with the conviction that there was nothing left to withstand the French. January 23rd, 1806. He was succeeded in office by a government of national defence formed by Charles Fox, who appeared unexpectedly in the Ministry of All the Talents as a liberal and patriotic minister. Since the campaign of Austerlitz had reduced the enemies of France to Great Britain and Russia, the Emperor's reconstruction of the European state system was directed against these two powers. It became the object of his policy to exclude British trade from the continent by a complete control of the European coastline, and to exclude Russia from Western Europe by the erection in Germany of a system subordinate to French policy, which could resist the Russian advance. In his design against British commerce, the Emperor dealt first with the Mediterranean trade. Whilst the Pope was directed to close his ports to the English flag, a French army had passed the Neapolitan frontier, and the royal family escaped to Palermo 7 days before its army evacuated Italy. Joseph Bonaparte became King of Naples and dutifully excluded British trade from the harbours of southern Italy, whilst the Bourbons were confined to the island of Sicily, and there kept open the last ports which remained accessible to British exports west of Corinth. The French control of Italy received a further emphasis from the creation of 21 Italian duchies and principalities, which served to decorate the Emperor's generals and ministers. He now turned his attention to the North Sea trade, and ensured a more efficient exclusion of British goods from Holland by the abolition of the Dutch Republic and the substitution of the kingdom of Louis Bonaparte. At the same time, the Rhenish territories of Prussia were converted into the Grand Duchy of Berg, which checked from its position on the Middle Rhine the importation of British goods into Central Europe. It was placed under the picturesque direction of Murat, the Emperor's brother-in-law, and an admirable commander of cavalry. A rearrangement of Germany sufficed to erect the opposition to Russia. The Dukes of Württemberg and Bavaria were made kings, and the Duke of Baden became a Grand Duke, whilst a series of royal marriages ensured the permanence of the French connection. These states, with 13 of the minor units of southwestern Germany, were formed into a new organization under French patronage named the Confederation of the Rhine. It was the Trans-Rhenan province of the French Empire. 25 days later, the Holy Roman Empire ceased to exist, August 6, 1806, and the transformation of Central Europe was complete. It was an element of the new system, which the Emperor opposed to the Russian effort in Central Europe, that Prussia should retain North Germany within the area of French control by a consistent adhesion to the French alliance. That arrangement was embodied in the Treaty of Schönbrunn, and when it no longer coincided with the real direction of Prussian policy, war became inevitable. If the Emperor could not control North Germany by diplomacy, he was obliged to control it by conquest. At first it seemed probable that the arrangement would be lasting. Russia negotiated for peace during the spring, and Prussia would be powerless against France without Russian support. But a change of direction in Russian policy coincided with a revolution in the Prussian temper. The war party, under the inspiration of Hardenberg and Queen Louisa, became predominant in Berlin, and the Prussian army was eager to justify its immense reputation by an abandonment of the enforced leisure of neutrality. A secret treaty was concluded with Russia in the summer, and when the directors of Prussian policy learned that Napoleon had expressed his contempt of them by an offer to England of their new possession of Hanover, Prussia was goaded into war. England entered the alliance on September 13th, and Fox lived long enough to superintend the formation of the Fourth Coalition. His liberalism had been able to direct his country toward the abolition of the British slave trade, but the European situation confined him inevitably to the traditional diplomacy of Pitt. The spring of Prussian policy and the model of Prussian armies were to be found in the tradition of Frederick the Great, and it was of some importance, when they were measured against a more modern force, that it was 20 years since his death and 40 years since his last war. The perilous balancing of Prussian neutrality, which reproduced his subtlety without his judgment, had already cost that country a military opportunity which was unlikely to recur, and it remained to be seen whether its army could put into successful operation the deliberate movements of the last generation in face of an enemy trained in 14 years of modern war. The Prussian army was mobilized in the late summer, and it concentrated in the early autumn behind its southern frontier with the design of annihilating the French troops in South Germany. The Emperor moved rapidly into northern Bavaria on the line of the Main. Whilst the Austrian frontier was observed by a Bavarian force, and the attention of Prussia was directed toward the French concentration on the lower Rhine, he moved by his right into Saxony, and lay across the left flank of the Prussian army. The French then wheeled westward onto the line of the Saale and threatened the roads between the Prussians and their capital. The Prussian forces were divided into two groups, and on the same day they endeavoured to break through the French positions. The Emperor at Jena and Davout at Auerstedt resisted the attempt and fought, 5 days after first contact, the decisive engagements of the campaign. The Prussian armies broke and ran for the Baltic, whilst the king withdrew to Königsberg on the Russian frontier. The retreat became unheroic, and French cavalry received the capitulations of Prussian fortresses, while Prussian troops surrendered along the northern roads. When the Emperor rode into Berlin, the French controlled all Prussia west of the Oder. In a campaign of 7 weeks, he had reduced the Hohenzollern from a European monarchy to a Baltic principality. The conquest of Prussia was the most complete, but, in a sense, the most unpremeditated of Napoleon's achievements. It had formed no part of his design until the Prussian temper of independence imposed it upon him in order to retain for France the control of North Germany. The establishment of French military authority followed as an immediate consequence, and the emperor availed himself of the extended area of control to provide an ex post facto justification of his enterprise by the perfection against Great Britain of the continental system. The method of exclusion had already been practiced in the ports of France, Italy, and Holland. Earlier in the year, the emperor had imposed it upon Prussia itself, and had drawn upon that country a British declaration of war, an embargo on Prussian shipping, and the proclamation of a blockade of the North Sea coast of Germany. He now reduced the system to a legal code in the Berlin Decree, which professed to vindicate the rights of neutrals against the blockades and search of the British. In reality, it was an endeavour to turn his European predominance against England, and to make the commerce of the continent manoeuvre like an army against the wealth of Great Britain. The British coast was proclaimed to be in a state of blockade by a government whose warships could not venture outside their harbours. British cargoes were declared lawful prize, and all intercourse with Great Britain was prohibited. The retort came in the following year, when the British government, by order in council, prohibited all trade between ports from which the English flag was excluded. The emperor replied from Warsaw by ordering the confiscation of all British goods in German harbours. The British then proclaimed a blockade of all ports practising the system of exclusion, and the emperor completed his code in the Milan decrees by forbidding any ship trading with the empire to touch at an English harbour. The continental system was in reality far less rigid than appeared from the uncompromising language of its paper blockades. Trade was carried on under a system of exceptions and licenses, and the economic life of Europe was not arrested by the terms of proclamations. But the result in Great Britain was the creation of considerable distress, and on the continent the war of custom houses contributed far more to the unpopularity of the empire than the march of its armies. But whilst the Fourth Coalition was in existence, the conquest of Europe was incomplete, and the result of Jena had produced no effect on the resistance of Russia. The Russian armies which might have saved Prussia were moving slowly through Poland, and the emperor turned eastwards to meet them. A Polish campaign in winter was an uninviting enterprise, but the emperor felt the necessity of arresting the Russian armies before they had effected their concentration, and he proposed to facilitate his operations in 3 ways. A profession of sympathy with Polish nationalism would secure him the advantage of a friendly country. A Persian alliance would threaten Russia in the Caucasus, and the diplomacy of Sebastiani at Constantinople drew Turkey into a declaration of war, which detained a Russian army on the lower Danube. The servility of Turkish policy, which, in spite of the bulk and complication of a Servian rising, became involved in a war with Russia for the convenience of France, entailed no consequences beyond the appearance of a British fleet before Constantinople and an unsuccessful English expedition to Egypt. In Poland, the emperor pressed the French offensive from the Oder to the Vistula. But although the Russians were forced back at Pultusk and Golemine, it was impossible to reproduce in the conditions of a Polish winter the precision and rapidity of normal European warfare, and at the end of the year the French armies were stationary round Warsaw, while their active efforts were confined to the siege of Danzig and Königsberg, which had been the objective of their movement, remained in possession of the Russo-Prussian forces. In 1807, operations were renewed before the winter was over by a Russian attack on the French positions. It was arrested, and the emperor endeavoured to destroy the Russians on their retreat. At Eylau he fought an inconclusive battle under severe conditions, in which his command was in considerable difficulties, owing to the quality of the weather and the Russian troops. The result of this engagement encouraged the Tsar and the King of Prussia to renew their alliance during the armistice which followed, and the emperor realized acutely the difficulties of his situation. it was almost impossible to fight successfully against Russia at the end of 800 miles of communications, and by this impossibility the emperor was driven to consider a Russian alliance, which was the sole alternative to a French conquest. When the war was resumed in the spring, Danzig had fallen, and the Russians again endeavoured to close the road to Königsberg by a vigorous offensive. It was unsuccessful, and on the anniversary of Marengo, the emperor was completely victorious at Friedland. The Russian army was shattered, and its commander advised the Tsar to negotiate in order to cover its reorganization. 5 days later, the French cavalry reached the Niemen. The elimination of Prussia was completed by the occupation of Königsberg, and the Tsar concluded an armistice with the French without consulting his ally. It had become possible for the two emperors to dispose absolutely of the peace of the continent, and at Tilsit they negotiated the partition of Europe. The meeting of Napoleon and Alexander took place with picturesque courtesy on a temporary houseboat moored in midstream of the river Niemen. The setting was characteristic of the emperor's spectacular diplomacy. The conversations were then transferred to the town of Tilsit on the south bank of the river, where they proceeded cordially with an accompaniment of international hospitality, resulting in less than a fortnight in the Peace of Tilsit. This settlement was contained in 3 documents: 2 treaties of peace between France, Russia, and Prussia, which effected the liquidation of the Fourth Coalition, and a secret treaty of alliance between France and Russia, which effected the partition of Europe. It resulted principally from the drift of Russian policy, which transferred Russia from the English to the French side in the European conflict. The cooperation of Great Britain in the War of the Fourth Coalition had been profoundly unsatisfactory to Russia. There had been a lack of generosity in the distribution of British subsidies, and a complete failure to supply the Russian armies with adequate military support. The British government had confined itself to an unsuccessful effort in the Levant, an expedition to South America, the dispatch of isolated detachments to Swedish Pomerania, and the belated contribution to Russia of a consignment of small arms. When vigorous naval action in the Baltic and the presence of a British force in maritime Prussia might have created a serious embarrassment to the emperor's operations in Poland. From this omission and the unheroic hesitations of Austrian diplomacy, it resulted that Alexander was not unwilling to change sides, and the powerful fascination with which Napoleon advocated the French alliance was hardly required in order to complete his conversion. It was the object of the European settlement to complete at the expense of Prussia the Napoleonic reconstruction of Germany, and although the King of Prussia was present at Tilsit, his participation was purely passive, and the interests of his country were sacrificed at every point. The treaties of Tilsit were the diplomatic expressions of the result of Jena. It had become an object of French policy to retain the control of North Germany, and since it was impossible to retain it through a Prussian alliance, it was necessary to modify the state system by the elimination of Prussia. The Confederation of the Rhine had been created as an instrument of French policy, and its territory was now increased at the expense of Prussia. A new unit was formed out of the Prussian lands lying west of the Elbe, and placed under the government of Jerome Bonaparte as the Kingdom of Westphalia. And a portion of southern Brandenburg was transferred to Saxony, whose elector was made a king and entered the Confederation. In addition to these losses, the Polish provinces of Prussia became the Grand Duchy of Warsaw and passed to the new King of Saxony under the supervision of a French resident. It resulted from these changes that the Prussian kingdom lost all political significance. Its area and population were reduced by almost 1/2, and it returned to the fragmentary structure of its earlier history. By its new conformation, it continued in occupation of its Baltic coastline, but behind that coastline, its provinces of Brandenburg and Silesia lay precariously wedged between two areas of French control, separating them at some points by a distance as narrow as 40 miles. Prussia became in effect a minor power of the Baltic coast, and was threatened on each side of its three frontiers by the growing states of Napoleonic Germany. To that menace there was added a war indemnity upon terms which prolonged the French military occupation until payment, and the customary burden of the continental system. The consent of Russia to the aggrandizement of Napoleonic Germany was secured upon easy terms, of which the foremost was the sacrifice of Poland. Napoleon had utilized Polish nationalism during his occupation of Warsaw, but he was content to neglect its claims as the price of a Russian alliance. The name of Poland was omitted from the settlement, and the Polish demand was met by the anodyne institution of the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. In return for this and an insignificant transfer of Prussian Polish territory, Alexander acquiesced in the emperor's reconstruction of Europe, and even contributed Cattaro and the Ionian Islands to his Adriatic positions. But the real price of Russian cooperation was to be found in the larger provisions of the secret treaty and the still more generous language of the conversations which preceded it. The emperor indicated to Alexander interminable avenues of conquest, down which the French and Russian armies moved to the subjugation of the East, while in Europe the two empires met along a frontier of the Vistula. But when the Tsar insisted upon the survival of Prussia, and the emperor declined to install the Russians in Constantinople, the objects of the alliance became less remote, and the emperors reverted to more practical proposals. It was their design to direct the offensive strength of the new combination against two powers, the western power of England and the eastern power of Turkey. The effort against England was to be directed upon familiar lines against British commerce by the extension to Russia of the continental system and the closing of the Baltic. The second measure would necessitate the coercion of the minor Baltic states, in the course of which Russia would be at liberty to absorb the Swedish territory of Finland. The fate of Turkey was less precisely foreshadowed, since the emperor's absolute refusal to consider a Russian conquest of Constantinople precluded a definitive partition of the Turkish Empire. This was postponed for subsequent discussion, whilst for the present it was found sufficient to indicate an increase of Russian territory on the lower Danube and an extension of French predominance on the Adriatic. Upon these terms the two empires united to impose upon Europe an irresistible military combination. While Russia was content with an illimitable prospect of conquest, France secured the more concrete substance of absolute control in Central Europe, and by the terms of a document approaching more nearly than anything else in diplomatic history to those singular partitions of the civilized world which marked the end of the Roman Republic, the empire, which had been the government of France, became, through the wars and policy of Napoleon, the government of Europe. End of section 23. Section 24 of the Partition of Europe by Philip Guedalla. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Book 3, Chapter 12, The Middle Empire, Part 1. The military effort which accompanied the revolution had resulted under the direction of Napoleon in the conquest of Europe. But he did not confine its effects to an ordinary increase of French territory. By a system of alliances and the creation of a group of subordinate governments, the Emperor of the French became the effective sovereign of all Europe west of the Russian and Austrian frontiers. the continent from Paris to Warsaw was governed by a single executive. The coasts of Europe, from Memel to Ragusa, were controlled by a single fiscal system, and its populations were mobilized as the contingents of a single army. The system of subordinate governments had been derived from the Italian policy of the Directory, but in the extension given to that system, and in its employment for the establishment of a European empire, it became the characteristic expression of Napoleonic policy. His generals became regents, his brothers became kings, and his national government became a continental dominion. That empire, which lay behind a land frontier from the Baltic to the head of the Adriatic, and governed Europe for 5 years, resulted from the emperor's reconstruction of the European state system. It was imposed upon Europe by the military predominance of France, and it was unable to survive that predominance by a week. But although its political existence was short, it was able to modify the course of European history by a single circumstance. It brought Europe into contact with the Revolution, and the results of that contact were active long after the centralized symmetry of the emperor's government had ceased to exist. The European empire of Napoleon stretched without interruption across the continent from sea to sea. It looked on the Atlantic through the ports of western France and the allied harbors of Spain, on the North Sea through the Dutch ports and the Hanse towns, on the Baltic through the towns of maritime Prussia, on the Mediterranean through the coasts of France and Italy, and on the Adriatic through the ports of eastern Italy and the Illyrian coast. But since it was the creation of the French armies, its principal aspect was territorial, and on this side it consisted of 2 salient positions held in advance of the eastern frontier of France: a German system, connected with France by the Kingdom of Holland, and extended further to the east by the territory of Poland, and an Italian system, connected with France by the Republic of Switzerland, and extended east of the Adriatic by the Illyrian provinces. It had been the object of the French monarchy to round off the eastern frontier. It was the achievement of the Revolution to advance that frontier to the Rhine, and it was the error of the empire that it substituted for a defensible military line an indefensible complex of subordinate governments. That complex was the Napoleonic state system. The Italian system, which was the least precarious of these erections, consisted of 3 units: the Kingdom of Italy, the Italian provinces of France, and the Kingdom of Naples. It was derived from the subordinate republics of the Directory, and when the Kingdom of Italy succeeded to the Italian Republic in 1805, some progress had been made towards the organization of an efficient government and the creation of a national temper. It had been possible for the Republic to produce an appearance of autonomy. In spite of the presence of a French army of occupation, Italian finances returned almost to stability, and a national force garrisoned Milan. The constitution of the new monarchy emphasized Italian unity by the centralization of Italian administration, and the regency and marriage of Eugène de Beauharnais indicated the prospect of a national dynasty. But after the annexation of Venetia, the emperor arrested the extension of the Italian kingdom, and treated it as only one among several Italian units. By a steady policy of annexation, the government of France itself was encroaching rapidly upon the territory of Italy. Piedmont was already in French hands, and the annexation of Genoa extended the Mediterranean coast of France. By a further series of annexations, the kingdom of Etruria lost its identity in a group of French departments, and the destruction of the Duchy of Parma extended French control in the valley of the Po. Finally, The Papal States were annexed to France, and Rome became the chief town of a French department. In the annexed provinces, the imperial government provided a generous supply of public works as a harmless substitute for political activity, and material prosperity took the place of the penurious patriotism of the Italian towns. Southern Italy was placed under the more genial supervision of the Kingdom of Naples. Joseph Bonaparte, the first king, was genuinely interested in reform, but a reign of 23 months was an inadequate period for the removal of the abuses of 3 centuries. And when Joseph was transferred to Madrid, Murat, his successor, was indisposed to interfere with conditions as picturesque as himself. Apart from his interest in the Neapolitan army and a rigorous enforcement of the conscription, the reign of Murat was mildly spectacular and uneventful. When the king was not commanding cavalry in Central Europe, he found in Naples a complete and enjoyable repose. The Napoleonic system imposed on Italy a condition of honourable servitude with an accompaniment of material prosperity. There was an inevitable loss of liberty under each of the 3 governments, but the foundations of Italian nationalism were laid by the centralization of Italian administration. Local separatism was effaced by the institution of the Italian army. Individualism vanished before the Code Civil, and Italy emerged from the long night of the Empire with the discovery of a national ideal. The Italian system was extended beyond the Adriatic by the military outpost of the Illyrian provinces. The occupation of Ragusa and Cattaro was an indication of the emperor's designs on the east, and the French government of the Adriatic hinterland was purely military. A succession of generals occupied the residency at Laibach, and although they professed a generous sympathy with Slovene and Albanian nationalism, the Illyrian territories were never more than the advanced base for a Balkan campaign which was never fought. The connection between the Italian and German systems was made by the French control of Switzerland, which had been completely subordinate to French policy since the mediation of the first consul. Napoleon himself was the first Landamann, and although Swiss territory underwent various modifications by French annexations, no survival of Swiss nationalism endangered, during the Empire, the French control of the Alpine roads. The imperial system in Central Europe was founded upon the Confederation of the Rhine. This organization, which was formed originally as a counterpoise to the Austrian power, became in its fullest form the Napoleonic substitute for the Holy Roman Empire. It was a traditional object of French policy to provide, by alliance with the states of Western Germany, a safeguard for the Rhine frontier, and in its first phase the Confederation achieved this object. It included the governments of Berg, Baden, Württemberg, and Bavaria, and it ensured by its confirmation the French control of the Middle Rhine and the Upper Danube. In its second phase, 1807, it received an increased importance from the creation of Westphalia and the inclusion of every government in Central Europe except Prussia and Austria. The Elbe became its northeastern frontier, and it even protruded in advance of the line of that river the salients of Saxony and Mecklenburg, which threatened upon 2 flanks the precarious and encircled position of Prussia. Its policy was completely subordinated to the direction of French diplomacy, and its army was always at the disposal of the emperor. The states which composed the Confederation of the Rhine were divided into 2 classes, those which the emperor had created and those which he had merely enlarged. The earliest of the territorial creations was the Grand Duchy of Berg, 1806. This unit, which was originally formed in order to close the Rhine to British trade and to observe the western frontier of Prussia, was placed under the nominal government of Murat. It received a considerable increase at the expense of Prussia, and in 1809, 3 years after its creation, when Murat was promoted King of Naples, the Grand Duchy passed under a regency in the name of Napoleon Louis, son of Louis Bonaparte, King of Holland. The Kingdom of Westphalia was a more considerable state. Brunswick, Hesse-Cassel, and the western territories of Prussia were thrown into a single unit for the benefit of Jerome Bonaparte. The conformation of this state, which was designed to threaten Prussia and to control the Elbe, the Ems, and the Weser, was as irrational as the political geography of the old Polish Republic. Jerome was completely incapable, and his government was confined by the continental system to the unfriendly functions of the tax collector. The remainder of Germany was controlled by the allies of France. In the centre, the Kingdom of Saxony received a vast increase of territory and approached nearer than it had yet advanced to its ambition of displacing Prussia, whilst in the south the 3 states which the Emperor had extended remained firm in the French alliance. In the new Kingdom of Bavaria, contact with the Revolution resulted in the creation of an organized administration and the practice of a vigorous anti-clericalism. Württemberg was violently reformed by its new king. His destruction of knights and estates was thorough and well-intentioned. But although the feudal foundations of German society were threatened by the importation of French principles and a revolutionary taste for liberty, they were able to survive by half a century their first contact with the Revolution, and the people of Baden were content to enjoy the new dignity of their Grand Duchy without hazarding their comfort in the precarious business of reform. The Napoleonic reconstruction of South Germany was less drastic than the measures simultaneously applied in North Germany, but its effects were more lasting, and it resulted from its political education that the future revolutions of Germany began south of the Main. In rear of Napoleonic Germany, the Emperor connected his positions in Central Europe with French territory by the subject Kingdom of Holland. This unit was placed under the government of Louis Bonaparte, an intelligent but depressing man, whom the Emperor had married to his stepdaughter Hortense de Beauharnais. His exercise of authority was mild and enlightened, but when he so far identified himself with the commercial interests of his subjects as to qualify his loyalty to the continental system, the Emperor sacrificed his brother to his fiscal policy, deposed the king, and annexed the territory of Holland to France, 1810. The reconstruction of Germany ensured to the Emperor the control of Central Europe. By the creation of the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, he completed that control and occupied in advance of his German frontier a salient position in Eastern Europe. The Grand Duchy, which was attached to the Kingdom of Saxony, formed an inadequate expression of Polish nationalism, but by its control of the Middle Vistula, it fulfilled admirably the requirements of French strategy. With its western frontier, it completed the ring which the Emperor had drawn around Prussia, and from its eastern frontier it observed Russia beyond the Niemen. The Grand Duchy was the earliest expression of French distrust of Russia. The cession to Alexander at Tilsit of a fraction of Prussian Poland had been designed to embitter the relations of Russia and Prussia. The creation of the Grand Duchy, where French officers could observe the Russian frontier and enlist the patriots of Poland, definitely contemplated the breakdown of the Franco-Russian alliance. So long as that system survived, the French government in Warsaw was a picturesque and superfluous concession to national sentiment. But if it ceased to exist, the Grand Duchy would provide in Eastern Europe the nucleus of a military frontier. It was the Polish March of the Empire. By the Peace of Tilsit, the European war was reduced to the war against England, and since British sea power rendered England impervious to all attacks except that on her trade, the Emperor proposed to perfect in the hands of the Franco-Russian alliance the continental system, 1807. It was his design to close the Baltic to British shipping, and it became necessary to bring Denmark and Sweden within the area of French control. He entrusted to Russia the business of coercing Sweden with the prospect of absorbing the Swedish territory of Finland, and he directed French policy toward the intimidation of Denmark. The British government appreciated that the Danish alliance carried with it the control of the Sound, and by a rapid decision, based almost certainly upon an effective secret service, it anticipated the Emperor. 9 days after the two emperors at Tilsit had resolved on the coercion of Denmark, Canning adopted their policy and prepared to impose upon the Danes an English alliance. The entrances to the Baltic by the Great Belt, the Little Belt, and the Sound were commanded by the coasts of Denmark, and if it was desirable for British strategy to maintain the communications between the North Sea and the unconquered government of Sweden, it was essential for British shipping to have access to the Baltic, and for British sea power to prevent the addition of the Danish fleet to the French forces. The Emperor prepared an invasion of Holstein, but the British blow fell first. 88 ships were moved rapidly into Danish waters, and the Prince Regent of Denmark, in his port of Kiel, was offered the British alliance on condition of the surrender of his fleet and of the coast defences which commanded the Sound. He refused, and a British expeditionary force was landed in Zeeland. The British alliance was once more rejected, and the seafront of Copenhagen was bombarded for 5 days by Gambier's warships. The town surrendered, and the Danish fleet and stores were removed to the coast of Norfolk. The bombardment of Copenhagen was an effective and brilliant exercise of sea power. This violation of international law shocked Napoleon into a paroxysm of protest, and alarmed the directors of Russian policy into a declaration of war against England. Although the Russian aristocracy was an unwilling collaborator with the representative of the revolution, and the Russian people observed with regret the loss of its English markets, the personal policy of Alexander, which had diverged sharply from England in the negotiations preceding the Peace of Tilsit, imposed upon Russia the French solution, and stifled, with the annexation of Finland and the occupation of the principalities, the growing suspicion that Napoleon intended to remain in permanent occupation of Silesia. The Emperor now turned for the completion of the continental system towards southern Europe, and prepared to stop the largest gap in the European tariff wall. Beyond the Pyrenees there still remained an opening for British trade, which resulted from the laxity of the Spanish administration and the obstinacy of Portuguese policy. Portugal had refused resolutely to enter the French fiscal system, and since the Emperor was determined to exclude British shipping from the Tagus, he was left with no alternative to the abolition of Portugal. By a remarkable treaty of partition, he proposed to transfer Algarve to Godoy, the Spanish minister, and northern Portugal to the Queen of Etruria, whilst the remaining provinces were to be annexed to Spain after a French occupation. Charles IV, who was perhaps the most unintelligent monarch in Europe, was fascinated with the prospect of a territorial increase and the impressive title of Emperor of the Indies, and acquiesced in the passage of French troops through Spain on the road to Portugal. Junot crossed Leon and passed the Portuguese frontier in execution of the project of partition. Within 8 days the royal family of Portugal sailed for Brazil, and 3 days later the command of Junot marched into Lisbon, November 27th, 1807. But the emperor's Spanish policy contained more than the apparent simplicity of the destruction of Portugal. It was unlikely that Napoleon proposed to invade Portugal in the interest of Spain without retaining some benefit for France. That benefit was the inclusion of Spain itself within the area of French control. Spanish policy, which was directed by Godoy, had attracted the emperor's suspicion by a premature demonstration of independence during the campaign of Jena. The Bourbon monarchy was in an unromantic decadence, and it might be possible, by directing the French armies against the ill-organized resources of Spain, to bring 1,000 miles of European coastline within the efficient administration of the continental system. The settlement of Tilsit appeared to leave the emperor leisure for this trivial enterprise, and whilst he conducted with Alexander a correspondence which was designed to complete the partition of the world, he developed his movement towards the more immediate object of his Spanish policy. The government of Spain was conducted by an ex-soldier whose sole claim to eminence was his intimacy with the unattractive queen of Charles IV. The king divided his interminable leisure between the pursuit of game and the irritation of his son Ferdinand, whose ambition had inspired him to apply for a Bonaparte princess in the hope of replacing his father on the Spanish throne. Whilst the command of Junot occupied Portugal, 2 French armies unobtrusively passed the Pyrenees and subjected Spain to a policy of peaceful penetration. French troops appeared unaccountably in command of the fortresses of northern Spain, and the emperor prepared by diplomacy the development of the French offensive. He repudiated the Partition Treaty of Fontainebleau, and his attitude toward Charles IV hardened into an impossible demand for the concession of a military road between France and Portugal, or the line of the Ebro as the French frontier. Godoy prepared to imitate the royal family of Portugal and to withdraw with the court to Majorca or Tenerife. But his prudent course was interrupted by a riot in the interest of Ferdinand. In the Journée of Aranjuez, March 18th to 19th, Godoy went from office into hiding and arrest, and Charles IV abdicated in favour of Ferdinand. 4 days later, Murat appeared in Madrid as the representative of Napoleon. Ferdinand was persuaded to visit Napoleon on French territory, and it was finally arranged that the emperor should arbitrate on the whole dispute at Bayonne. Whilst the Spanish monarchy pleaded its cause with Napoleon beyond the Pyrenees, the French were in informal occupation of Madrid, and their presence provoked the nationalist riot of the 2 Mayo, May 2nd, 1808. Within 8 days, Charles and Ferdinand in succession had abdicated the Spanish throne, and 5 weeks later Joseph Bonaparte was proclaimed King of Spain. It was a challenge which Spanish nationalism could not fail to accept. End of section 24. Section 25 of the Partition of Europe by Philip Guedalla. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Book 3, Chapter 12, The Middle Empire, Part 2. The objects of French policy, which had coincided hitherto with the European interests of France, were now extended to include the Spanish experiment of Napoleon. It was the emperor's design to impose upon Spain a French king, and he exhibited in that design a total ignorance of the Spanish temper. Whilst Joseph at Bayonne presided over the hasty construction of a modern constitution, 6 provinces proclaimed provisional governments and 3 appealed to England. Spaniards were indifferent to the benefits of the revolution, but they were alive to the advantages of independence, and the new king found himself with an entire kingdom in armed revolt. Joseph passed the Bidasoa and entered Madrid after a march of 12 days. The military opposition was not serious, and his escort of French troops ensured a demonstration of Spanish complacence in the capital. 3 days later, on July 23, 1808, a French force of 17,000 men, which had been operating against the insurrection in Andalusia, surrendered at Bailén. It was a mixed force of French reserves, Swiss infantry and marines, and was not a command of any distinction, but the capture of imperial troops by a Spanish commando was of immense importance. When Reading and Castaños encircled Dupont at Bailén, their action demonstrated the futility of the Spanish experiment, and even reacted on the politics of Central Europe. Within 3 days of Bailén, Joseph left Madrid, and the Napoleonic kingdom of Spain was reduced to the ground occupied by its armies. 48 hours later, a British force landed on the Portuguese coast, and the Peninsular War had commenced. The destruction of Portugal exposed the French effort to an exercise of British sea power. It was possible for an expeditionary force based on the coast to operate in security against the French. The sea offered to the British in Portugal a line of communication and a line of retreat. Their supplies passed in from overseas without interruption, and their transports could withdraw them from the board if at any time the game went against them. In pursuit of this plan, the command of Wellesley, an Irish officer with an Indian reputation, landed at Mondego Bay and moved southward on Lisbon. A French offensive failed completely at Vimiero, and Junot, by the terms of the Convention of Sintra, withdrew his force to France in British transports. Portugal ceased to be a French province and became a British base. It was the end of the Portuguese experiment. At this point, the emperor was distracted toward the situation of Central Europe. He had conducted with Alexander in the early months of the year a correspondence which was intended to complete the agreement of Tilsit. Although French opinion was alarmed by the Russian occupation of the Danubian principalities, and Russia was disturbed by the French attitude in Silesia, the two emperors projected on the lines of romance a Franco-Russian invasion of the East, having for its object the capture of British India. The first step was to be the movement against Constantinople by a Russian army from the Caucasus and a French army from the Adriatic. Napoleon even translated the project into practice by strengthening the French forces in Dalmatia. But the Allies could not agree upon the fate of Constantinople, and their dreams were interrupted by the difficulties encountered in Spain. Napoleon reduced the focus of his plans, and it became his object to entrust to Russia the control of Central Europe, whilst he directed the full weight of French arms against the resistance of Spain. He met Alexander at Erfurt, and in the ensuing conversations the Tsar consented to postpone once more the partition of Turkey, and in return for the principalities to impose peace upon Austria. By the Convention of Erfurt, October 12, 1808, Russia agreed to paralyze by a mobilization the threatened action of Austria and to direct the Franco-Russian alliance against the Austrian power, in order that France might have leisure to reduce Spain. Relieved from his apprehensions in Central Europe, the emperor returned to Bayonne in the late autumn and concentrated the French armies in the Western Pyrenees. The King of Spain was behind the Ebro, and his kingdom was in revolt. The French conducted a friendly invasion to restore him to his capital, and dealt adequately in a series of one-sided engagements with the ill-concerted efforts of the national resistance. In a march of 4 weeks, the emperor moved rapidly on Madrid, and when he entered the city, the French controlled northern Spain outside the walls of Saragossa, where Palafox maintained against Lannes a desperate defensive. His brief occupation of the capital was spent in measures of progress, which scandalized Spanish opinion. In less than 3 weeks he had abolished the Inquisition, feudal dues, and the system of provincial fiscal barriers, when his residence in Madrid was interrupted by the diversion of Sir John Moore. That commander was operating from Portugal against the French right, and it was his design to draw the emperor into northwestern Spain in order to give time for the organization of Spanish resistance in the south. Moving northwards from Salamanca, he threatened the French communications between Burgos and Valladolid. The emperor responded at once and swept north to destroy him. Whilst Moore was operating in Leon against Soult, Napoleon moved out of Madrid, passed the Guadarrama, and pursued the English in midwinter through a mountainous country. Contact was maintained in a series of rearguard actions, but before the decisive engagement the emperor left the army, whilst Moore withdrew through the mountains of Galicia to the sea. On January 1st, 1809, Napoleon went from Astorga towards Paris to direct his policy against Austria. The English reached their transports 2 marches ahead of the French and maintained at Corunna a successful defensive, after a diversion which had drawn the French armies on a march of 300 miles into the angle of Galicia. The Spanish insurrection had been given its opportunity. The emperor left Spain in order to maintain in Central Europe the system of Tilsit and Erfurt. It was threatened from 2 directions, by the policy of Austria and the new temper of nationalism. The Austrian power, which was excluded from Central Europe by the reconstruction of Germany, and from Eastern Europe by the combination of France and Russia, realized in the years following Austerlitz the supreme danger of its position, and had undertaken in face of Napoleon a work of national reconstruction. By the effort of the Archduke Charles, the army was reorganized, and the creation of the Landwehr provided it with a national reserve. Austrian policy, which received from Stadion a more intelligent direction, endeavoured to detach Russia from France by the mission of Schwarzenberg to St. Petersburg, and its militant tendencies received every encouragement from Great Britain. It appeared not unlikely, from the condition of German opinion, that an Austrian effort would be supported elsewhere in Central Europe. The creation of German patriotism was a consequence of the French domination, and the resistance of Spain stimulated nationalists throughout Europe. The Tugendbund was a patriotic organization of unknown extent, and the reconstruction of Prussia by Stein, Scharnhorst, and Bülow provided a focus for North German sentiment. To these circumstances there was added the fact that Austrian finances could not support for many more months the expense of an army on a war footing, and it was not surprising that the directors of Austrian policy, with the example of Spanish militancy, the expectation of a German rising, and the hope of Russian neutrality, joined England in the Fifth Coalition. It appeared at first that the direction of the campaign would be oriental. The condition of Turkey had occasioned the emperor's return from Spain, and he issued orders for the concentration at Toulon of a Turkish expeditionary force. In this event it was the Austrian design to cut his communications with the East by a movement in the Adriatic, but it is possible that his Turkish project was only intended to ensure the cooperation of Russia in the war in Central Europe. In reply to the Austrian armaments the Empire mobilized, the forces of France and the Confederation of the Rhine were put on a war footing, and the gap caused by the absence of troops in Spain was filled by calling up the conscription of 1810. The monarchy had anticipated its revenue of money. The Empire anticipated its revenue of men, and bankruptcy was the result in both cases. The French army was concentrating in Bavaria under the command of Berthier, when the Austrians, without a declaration of war, passed the Bavarian frontier. Berthier, who was unaccustomed to responsible command, was unequal to the situation, and the Archduke Charles was at liberty to destroy the French in the absence of Napoleon. With the arrival of the Emperor, his opportunity ended, and the campaign became serious. In a manoeuvre of 5 days, he drove the Austrians off the middle Danube into Bohemia. The daily victories of Leughen, Abensberg, Landshut, Eckmühl, and Ratisbon opened the road to Vienna by the line of the Danube, and within 3 weeks of the Emperor's arrival in Bavaria, the French marched into the capital. The Archduke Charles had taken position outside the city on the northern bank of the Danube, and the first attempt to dislodge him failed completely in the battle of Aspern-Essling. The French army withdrew into the island of Lobau, between the Archduke and the capital. Meanwhile, the national rising had completely collapsed. The Tyrolese under Andreas Hofer struggled without success against the forces of France and Bavaria. Katt failed to raid Magdeburg, and the national effort of Germany was reduced to the ineffectual forays of Dürnfeld, Schill, and the Duke of Brunswick-Elz. The French reverse at Bailen gave the Germans confidence, but it could not give them strength. A more significant enterprise was the Russian campaign in Austrian Poland. It had been Napoleon's design that the Russian troops should cooperate with a Polish insurrection directed by Poniatowski against the Austrians, but the Russian commander failed completely to translate the Franco-Russian alliance into effective military action. It resulted from Galitzин's qualified enthusiasm for his French allies and his marked distaste for Polish rebels that his operations against the Archduke Ferdinand were conducted on singularly sympathetic lines. 7 casualties were sustained by the Austrians in the sole engagement of the campaign, and the Russians marched into Cracow almost without firing a shot. The Regent Eugene conducted a respectable campaign in Italy, in which he was eventually able to sweep the Austrians through the Eastern Alps, and by the Battle of Raab to direct their retreat towards Hungary, June 14th, 1809. In a period of 6 weeks the Emperor had quadrupled his forces in Lobau, whilst he himself resided at Schönbrunn, and the Archduke Charles waited to receive the French offensive on the Marchfeld. On a summer night, July 5th, the French forces executed a brilliant passage of the Danube and turned the Austrian left, and the Archduke withdrew from the position of Aspern-Essling to the position of Wagram, where his army enclosed in an angle the plain of the Marchfeld. The Emperor accepted this central position, and on the following morning he developed the French attack. The French infantry, massed in the close formations which its decline in quality had made necessary, was incompletely successful, but a charge of 12 regiments of cavalry broke the Austrian line, and it was possible 6 days later to impose the armistice of Znaim. The suppression of the Austrian effort was completed by the Peace of Schönbrunn, October 14th, 1809. The government which had attempted it was punished by a heavy indemnity, an insulting reduction of its armed forces, and the loss of its Polish, Alpine, and Adriatic provinces. Austrian Poland was distributed between Russia and the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. Tyrol and the neighbouring districts passed to Bavaria, and the French Empire annexed to its Illyrian provinces Villach, Carniola, and the Adriatic littoral. Fiume and Trieste became French ports, and the conquest of the Adriatic, which had begun 12 years before with Bonaparte's occupation of Ancona, was completed. The result of the war between France and Austria was due to the action of their respective allies. If Russia had intervened seriously in Galicia, the French success might have been greater, and if England had made an effective diversion at Antwerp, the Austrian failure might have been less. It resulted from British inactivity, which sent an expedition to the Scheldt in the late summer and permitted it to waste time at Flushing and strength at Walcheren, that Austria confronted France without serious support. National sentiment, which in 1813 swept the French out of Central Europe, proved in 1809 an inadequate substitute for organized strength. When the emperor returned from the campaign of Wagram, the empire entered upon a period of peace. With the exception of the Spanish War, it was at peace for 2 years, and during that time it enjoyed in apparent security the benefits of firm government. The political life of France, which had virtually ceased to exist, approached most nearly to activity in the urgency of the Church question. The first consul had come in collision with the papacy by the Article Organique, but the breach was apparently healed when Pius VII travelled to Paris for his coronation. It was impossible, however, for the secular government of France to remain at peace with the Pope. The occupation of Rome provoked the excommunication of the emperor, and the emperor replied with the arrest of the Pope. Pius was removed from Rome to Savona, and declined pardonably to sanction the emperor's nominations to French sees. The Pope, who was the prisoner of the Préfet of Montenotte, endeavoured to suspend the ecclesiastical life of France, and the emperor in return vigorously persecuted the bishops who supported their superior. The whole struggle, which resulted eventually in the removal of the Pope to Fontainebleau and the conclusion of the Second Concordat, was a reproduction of the hostility between the Revolution and the Church, and demonstrated in the eyes of Europe that there had been no real breach with the tradition of 1790. The emperor was the heir of the Revolution. During the same period he completed the organization of Europe by a series of annexations, which left France with an eastern frontier from Spezia to Lübeck. It appeared that the continental system could only be administered efficiently by the government of France itself, and independent units were accordingly absorbed in French territory. The Kingdom of Holland was suppressed because its fiscal orthodoxy was questionable, and it had not dealt adequately with the British expedition to the Scheldt. Its territory was merged in a group of French departments, and the French coast was extended still further by the North German annexations, which brought France up to the Danish frontier. The Hanseatic littoral between the Ems and the Elbe was absorbed, in order that French custom houses might be established in Bremen and Hamburg, and the addition of Lübeck even gave to France a port on the Baltic. Whilst the emperor extended the French frontier beyond all previous limits, he established by his divorce and remarriage the prospects of his dynasty. The Empress Josephine filled admirably the brilliant position which was imposed on her by her successive promotions from générale to présidente of the consular republic, and from présidente to Empress of the French. But she had no child by her second husband, and when experience demonstrated the disloyalty or incapacity of his brothers, an heir in the direct line became necessary. The emperor, who said at St. Helena she was the best woman in France, approached the separation with grave regret. But his family relations were subordinated to his policy, and Josephine acquiesced in the divorce at a council of the Bonapartes, 1810. The marriage was dissolved by the Senate, and the emperor's view of the invalidity of the religious ceremony was accepted by the Episcopal Tribunal of Paris. Having obtained a divorce, Napoleon entered the European marriage market. A negotiation for the Russian Grand Duchess Anna Pavlovna was unsuccessful, and the emperor resolved to ensure his control of Central Europe by an Austrian marriage. After an interval of diplomacy, the Archduchess Marie-Louise, daughter of Francis II, was married to Napoleon in Vienna, Saint-Cloud, and the Louvre. His proxy at the Austrian ceremony was the Archduke Charles, and the marriage appeared to efface the memory of Wagram and to ensure the permanent alliance of France and Austria. A son was born to the new empress, and the boy began as King of Rome the ineffectual career which was to close 21 years later in a suburb of Vienna. The emperor had exiled the Bourbons and humiliated the Hohenzollerns. He married a Habsburg. End of section 25. Section 26 of The Partition of Europe by Philip Guedalla. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Book 3, Chapter 13. The Late Empire, Part 1. The French Empire entered upon its last phase at the moment of its greatest magnificence. The emperor was the acknowledged master of the continent. Paris was the capital of Europe, and Rome was the second city of the empire. The Pope was an insubordinate ecclesiastic upon French territory. The Holy Roman Empire had ceased to exist, and the state system of Europe dated from the French conquest. The ideal of universal empire had been often entertained, but it was never more completely realized. Frenchmen, Germans, Italians, Croats, and Poles marched in the same armies and lived by the same laws, and the continent of Europe was subjected to the will of a single man. But the decadence of the empire when it came was sudden and complete, and it resulted from two causes: the prolonged resistance of England and the growing hostility of Russia. The defeat of England was the outstanding object of imperial policy, and so long as that object was unattained, the empire was exposed to grave dangers. Universal peace was the essential prelude of universal empire, and the English war imposed upon Europe the discontent resulting from the continental system and the nationalism resulting from the Spanish resistance. The empire was affected still more vitally by the drift of Russian policy. The emperor had made the Franco-Russian alliance the foundation of his system, and its preservation was essential to an empire which possessed no defensible frontier in Eastern Europe. The commercial warfare against England, which put Germans to the pains of importing coffee into Hamburg in hearses and buying sugar by way of Salonika and Belgrade, was an irritation to Central Europe. But that irritation might well deepen into rebellion if the example of Russia was added to the example of Spain. The Spanish enterprise of Napoleon had provided England with a means of exercising upon the empire effective military pressure. British armies had rarely enjoyed upon the continent a more convenient theatre of war than the territory of Spain and Portugal. The national rebellion provided them with the benefits of a friendly country, and the command of the sea ensured to them liberty of manoeuvre, continuity of supply, and the certainty of a safe retreat. The course of operations was to demonstrate to the full the advantage of a peninsular war to the land forces of a maritime power. When, in 1809, the French armies recovered from the dislocation consequent upon the diversion of Sir John Moore, they prepared to suppress the Spanish rebellion, whilst Soult moved into Portugal in order to arrest a further British offensive by an occupation of the Atlantic ports. He succeeded in reaching the Douro and seized Oporto, but the landing of Wellesley at Lisbon with an expeditionary force of 26,000 men was unopposed. The British moved northwards from the Tagus, and the French were completely outmanoeuvred. On May 12th, Wellesley effected a brilliant passage of the Douro above Oporto, and in a campaign of 9 days Soult was driven into Galicia with the loss of 4,000 men and all his artillery. Having cleared Portugal, which became the British base, Wellesley directed his offensive towards Spain. Jourdan, who was in supreme command of the armies of King Joseph, prepared to defend the capital by a defensive on the Middle Tagus. The British moved into Spain by the line of that river, and effected a junction with a Spanish force in Estremadura. On July 27th, the allies were attacked and positioned at Talavera, and the Spanish troops were severely shaken by French cavalry in a pistol skirmish. On the following day, the French attack was seriously developed without success, and it appeared possible for Wellesley and Cuesta to march on Madrid. But their advance was arrested by the operations of Soult against their communications. He had moved southwards from Salamanca towards the Tagus, brushed aside a Portuguese force, and destroyed the British base at Plasencia. Wellesley observed the menace to his line of retreat, and hastily withdrew, in order to escape isolation in the centre of Spain. The British raced for the bridge of Almaraz, and fell back from the Tagus to the Guadiana, between Elvas and Badajoz. The national forces of Spain were equally unsuccessful, and the French had small difficulties during the year in winning the victories of Medellin, Ocaña, and Alba de Tormes. The eruption of Wellesley into Spain, although it was unsuccessful in its immediate results, had convinced the Emperor of the danger created by the presence of the British in the peninsula, and in the following year he made a serious effort to drive them into the sea. 7 provinces of Spain were detached from Joseph's kingdom and converted into French military governments. It was intended by this measure to ensure a more complete control of the northern roads, and to found the French effort upon a more solid foundation than the precarious monarchy of an intrusive king. The termination of the campaign against Austria liberated the Grande Armée for service in Spain, and in the summer Massena passed the Pyrenees with a command far superior in quality to the French troops already in the field. The Catalonian rebels were defeated at Valls, February 25th, 1810, and Soult conducted a military excursion through Andalusia, where Cadiz alone held out as the seat of a national junta. It resulted that the whole of Spain, with the exception of Galicia in the northwest, Valencia in the southeast, and the fortresses of Ciudad Rodrigo, Badajoz, and Cadiz, was controlled by a French field army of 270,000 men. But the real direction of the French effort was against the British. Wellington was disinclined to oppose the French on the Portuguese frontier, and permitted Massena to besiege and capture the fortresses of Ciudad Rodrigo and Almeida, whilst he prepared a more elaborate defensive in the neighbourhood of Lisbon. Massena moved down the Mondego and attacked the British at Busaco without success. Wellington, however, was not tempted to abandon his defensive, and withdrew to the lines of Torres Vedras. This position lay across a peninsula formed between the Tagus and the sea, and its natural strength had been emphasized by elaborate fortification. The works were well connected and heavily armed, lying in 3 successive lines. The position was in complete communication with the sea, where British warships and transports ensured the safe supply and retreat of Wellington's army. But a more serious obstacle had been raised in the path of the French offensive by the systematic removal of all supplies from the vicinity of the lines, and it was this glacis of starvation which finally arrested Massena. The French commander appreciated the strength of the English position and declined to attack it before the arrival of reinforcements. For a period of 5 weeks he endeavoured to support his army on the country, until he was compelled by the problem of supply to withdraw from Torres Vedras to Santarém. But the system which enabled French armies to live on the fertile and populous regions of Central Europe was inapplicable to Portugal, and in the new year, 1811, Massena was compelled to continue his retreat toward the Spanish frontier. In spite of the activity of the British at Cadiz, which resulted in the successful sortie of Barossa, the command of Soult moved northwards out of Andalusia to join Massena, who was fighting a series of rearguard actions in eastern Portugal. The lines of Torres Vedras had effectually checked the Grande Armée, and Wellington was in undisputed control of Portugal. In its next phase, the war became a struggle for the fortresses of the Spanish frontier. The British were prepared to break out of Portugal, and it became necessary for them to hold the strong places which controlled the eastern roads. Whilst Wellington moved against Almeida, Beresford blockaded Badajoz, and the French endeavoured to relieve both fortresses. Cooperation between the marshals was indifferent, and the army of Portugal was disinclined to any serious effort after its experience before Torres Vedras. Massena failed at Fuentes d'Onoro to relieve Almeida, and Marmont superseded him, whilst the fortress itself fell. Soult attacked Beresford at Albuera in an attempt to relieve Badajoz, which eventually succeeded after his junction with Marmont. In the remainder of the year, Wellington made an unsuccessful attack on Ciudad Rodrigo, while the French armies conducted a campaign of complete but unsatisfying victories over the Spanish armies. The rebellion was ubiquitous, and the national forces, although their operations were rarely successful, were singularly intangible. In 1812, Wellington now seriously developed the British offensive. The French were distracted by the effort of the Russian expedition, and their strength was reduced by the drain of men towards Eastern Europe. The English entered Spain and returned successfully to the War of Sieges. Ciudad Rodrigo and Badajoz fell in succession, and Wellington was at liberty to threaten the northern roads which joined Madrid to the French frontier. Marmont concluded a successful campaign in Leon until he was betrayed into the false manoeuvre of Salamanca, which enabled the British to encourage Madrid by a momentary occupation. The French abandoned the siege of Cadiz and withdrew from Andalusia to central Spain. The successful operations of Suchet against the Catalans formed almost the sole exception to the French failure. The British advance now imposed upon the French their last offensive. In the following year, 1813, Joseph withdrew from Madrid to the line of the Ebro, and the Bonaparte monarchy in Spain ceased to be a government and became an army in retreat. It was the end of the Spanish experiment. Whilst Jourdan endeavoured to escort the retreating court toward the Western Pyrenees, Wellington threatened by a rapid movement his road towards France. At Vitoria he defeated Joseph severely, and 2 weeks later the King of Spain was behind the Bidasoa. The British, whose base was the nearest port, transferred their operations to the northwestern provinces and threatened the French frontier. Wellington moved toward the Western Pyrenees, and San Sebastian was captured. In the autumn he passed into France and engaged Soult on the line of the Nivelle in a struggle for Bayonne. The Peninsular War had deepened into the invasion of France, and that invasion was the prelude to the fall of the Empire. The Peninsular War, which resulted from the Spanish experiment of Napoleon, was a disastrous incident of the late Empire. Whilst it afforded on the continent an example of national rebellion and an opportunity for English activity, it distracted the French administration with a steady drain of valuable if secondary troops. The facile miscalculation which had induced the Emperor to repeat in Spain the humiliating methods applicable to the more docile populations of Central Europe was never retrieved, and the peninsula became the grave of French military reputations. The series of errors which began when French policy threatened with partition and conquest the most intractable nation in Europe was continued in the conduct of the war. In 1809, the Emperor returned to France before the Spanish rebellion was completely suppressed. In 1810, the French armies proceeded with the conquest of Andalusia before Wellington was expelled from the peninsula. In 1811, Massena was inadequately supported with reinforcements before Torres Vedras, and in 1813 French strategy persisted in the futile effort to hold Spain with armies which, if transferred to Central Europe, might have saved the empire. It resulted that England conducted a successful continental war, and Spanish nationalism became an example of European significance. Wellington won a reputation and expelled the French from Spain, but the Spanish armies provoked a temper which expelled the empire from Europe. Mina, Mendizabal, and El Empecinado showed the way to Stein and Scharnhorst, and the Spanish guerrillero was the precursor of the Prussian conscript. The collapse of the French Empire was preceded by the breakdown of the Franco-Russian alliance. The bankruptcy of the system of Tilsit had been demonstrated by the unenthusiastic cooperation of Russia in the campaign of 1809, and it was emphasized by every development of French policy. The objections which were raised by the Russian court to the marriage of Napoleon and the Grand Duchess Anna resulted in the Austrian marriage and a transfer of French interest from St. Petersburg to Vienna. Russian enthusiasm for the French alliance was steadily diminished by the intolerable pressure of the continental system on a country whose natural market was Great Britain. When Napoleon strengthened that system by the Trianon Decree and directed Russia to exclude neutral carriers of British merchandise, Alexander replied with a tariff discriminating against the products of France. Meanwhile, the prizes with which Russian concurrence had been purchased at Tilsit were shown to be largely illusory. The war against Turkey degenerated into an unsatisfying campaign among the strong places of the lower Danube, and the annexation of Finland was a disappointing compensation. It even appeared from the advance of French policy in the affairs of Sweden that Napoleon had adopted a definitely hostile attitude towards the Baltic ambitions of Russia. Bernadotte, a French general and prince of the empire, was adopted as the Napoleonic candidate for the Swedish throne. His election alienated Alexander and indicated the creation in Sweden of a second Poland, where French influence might support Scandinavian nationalism against Russian expansion. In 1811, the annexations by which the French Empire was extended in Europe were a source of grave alarm in St. Petersburg, and when the suppression of Oldenburg dispossessed the Tsar's brother-in-law, it was obvious that Napoleon had ceased to cultivate Alexander's friendship. The advance of French power in the Baltic indicated the cleavage of national interests, and Alexander was at liberty to develop his personal policy towards the empire. The Tsar's attitude was based mainly on his view of the Polish problem. He had regarded with profound suspicion the foundation of the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, and when its power was extended by the territory acquired from Austria in 1809, he resolved to re-establish the Russian control of Poland. An offer of support to Polish nationalists was followed by the concentration of Russian troops on the Polish frontier. Napoleon was surprised by the Russian initiative, but he was able to relieve the pressure by a rapid movement of troops into northern Germany, and Alexander withdrew from his position. It now appeared that it was an object of Russian policy to suppress the Polish state, and Napoleon, as the heir of the revolution, was incapable of such a surrender. In an effective scene with the Russian ambassador, he challenged the Russians to encamp on the hill of Montmartre, and the rift between the two powers was complete. The Russian ultimatum of 1812 demanded permission to trade with neutrals, a reduction of the garrison of Danzig, and the evacuation of Prussia and Swedish Pomerania. the emperor declined to withdraw from the position imposed upon him by the continental system, and replied with the diplomatic preparations for a war and the mobilization of Western Europe. The French alliance was imposed upon Prussia and Austria, and whilst those powers explained in St. Petersburg the helplessness of their position, they consented in Paris to contribute contingents to the Grande Armée. Russian diplomacy prepared for the war by an alliance with the French King of Sweden, a coalition in the traditional form with Great Britain, and the conclusion with Turkey of the Treaty of Bucharest, which liberated the Russian forces in the Danube Valley for a campaign in western Russia. The Russian armies were aligned to receive the French offensive in Lithuania, whilst the armed forces of France moved slowly across Europe. In the early summer of 1812, when the French Empire contained 130 departments, and French suzerainty controlled 7 kingdoms and 30 principalities, the Emperor Napoleon directed the greatest movement of troops that Europe had yet seen. 600,000 men marched on the Russian frontier, and Napoleon drove out of Paris to command an army containing every continental nationality west of the Balkans. It was an invasion of Russia by Europe. The emperor passed into Central Europe and held at Dresden a final court of his subject kingdoms. From Saxony he moved into Poland and entered Posen. He had no time in the course of a military operation to consider Polish susceptibilities, and the Polish regiments were scattered among the divisions of his army. Nationalism was stimulated by the Revolution, but the empire had become an international institution, and its government was that of an army in the field. In the 3rd week of June, war was declared by proclamation, and in 4 days 400,000 men passed the Russian frontier by bridges across the Niemen. End of section 26. Section 27 of The Partition of Europe by Philip Guedalla. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Book 3, Chapter 13, The Last Empire, Part 2. The invasion of Russia was rendered almost unnaturally easy by the passive defensive adopted by the Russian commanders. Moscow, which was the emperor's objective, lay more than 500 miles behind the frontier, but the French armies passed across western Russia in a march of 12 weeks and encountered serious opposition only twice on their journey. In reality, Russia opposed to Napoleon not the defensive maneuver, but the defensive distance. An army advancing in a hostile country is compelled, apart from its natural shrinkage by desertion and disease, to diminish its striking force by the detachments which protect the increasing line of its communications. It resulted that when the Grande Armée fought at Smolensk, its first serious engagement, it had already lost 150,000 men. The Russians resumed their retreat, and in the late summer Napoleon followed them into central Russia. The problem of supply had already driven the French troops to pillage, and they suffered considerably from the heat of the Russian plain. 500 miles behind the frontier, the Russian defensive prepared once more to arrest the invasion before the position of Borodino. The French attack was successful after a reckless sacrifice of men, and 8 days later the emperor rode into Moscow, September 15th, 1812. It was quite deserted. Napoleon realized that the occupation of Moscow was not the conquest of Russia, and its value is diminished still further by the fires which broke out on the day of his arrival. For 4 days the city burned, whilst the French army endeavoured to save the capital from Russian incendiaries. It was obvious that an army which could not reach and destroy its enemy was powerless to conquer a country and impose peace on its government, and the emperor endeavoured to negotiate with Alexander. The negotiation failed, and after an occupation of 4 weeks, the French turned westwards out of Moscow, October 19th. The retreat had begun. The invasion had surmounted the Russian summer. The retreat was confronted with the Russian winter. The European effort of Napoleon had moved 100,000 men into Moscow. It remained for him to withdraw them to the Polish frontier in face of the Russian armies. An attempt to strike for the southern roads was arrested at Malo-Yaroslavets 24 hours after the French rearguard blew up the Kremlin, and the army was driven back upon its original route, where it had exhausted all supplies between Moscow and the magazines of Smolensk. 2 weeks later, while the French were still beyond the Dnieper, the first snow fell, and death by cold was added to death by starvation in the prospect of the retreat. The troops from southern Europe suffered terribly, and the Russian cavalry followed every movement of the retreating army, of which only 40,000 men were fit to be put in line. At this time the Emperor had news of a republican plot in Paris, which ended in the execution of a madman named Mallet, but emphasized the danger of his isolation in the interior of Russia. 3 months after the Grande Armée had first entered Smolensk, an effective force of 34,000 men straggled into the town and found the magazines empty. The retreat was resumed, but a serious interruption was caused by Russian attacks at Krasnoy. 8 days later the army reached the Beresina, and its passage of the river, which was threatened by 2 Russian armies, was effected with the sacrifice of its trailing rearguard. 6 days later the Emperor left the army at Smorgoni and drove westward without an escort, and within a week 20,000 men, preserved from the Cossacks by the precarious rearguard actions of Ney, passed behind the Niemen. The Grande Armée, which had attempted the invasion of Russia, had ceased to exist. In a campaign of 6 months it had marched 1,000 miles and had entered the enemy's capital. But since it had failed to destroy the armed forces of Russia, its operations were without military significance. Its losses numbered 250,000 dead and 130,000 captured. But its failure meant more than the failure of a single enterprise or the loss of a single army. The Grande Armée had embodied the military power of the French Empire, and when that army ceased to exist, the Napoleonic system ceased with it. The loss of the Polish regiments brought with it the loss of Poland. The loss of the German regiments was the end of the Confederation of the Rhine. And the retreat of the French army from Moscow was a retreat which could not end east of Paris. In its second phase, the collapse of the French Empire took the form of a desperate defensive in Central Europe. The French armies had failed to penetrate successfully beyond the Niemen, and their effort was now directed toward maintaining the integrity of Napoleonic Germany. The decisive factor at this stage was the attitude of Prussia, and that attitude was defined before the year ended, when the commander of the Prussian corps negotiated an armistice of 2 months with the Russians. The French were isolated in northeastern Germany, and Eugene, who had succeeded Murat in the command, was compelled to evacuate Prussia in face of the Russian advance. While the Russians occupied Silesia, the French withdrew to the Elbe, and only held in advance of that line the fortresses of Danzig and the Mittelode. But even in Saxony the French position was insecure, since it was threatened on 2 flanks by the defection of the Emperor's allies. Prussian neutrality was ominous for the security of the French left, and a graver menace to their right was indicated by the drift of Austrian policy, which had induced Schwarzenberg to remove the Austrian force from the theatre of war. French resources had not been exhausted by the destruction of the Grande Armée, and the Emperor created a new army of 500,000 men. The conscription of 1813 had been anticipated, but the conscription of 1814 produced an admirable class of young soldiers. Troops were withdrawn from Spain, 30,000 marines were drafted from the war harbours into Germany, and a territorial infantry was created. It resulted that Napoleon opposed to Russia in Central Europe a substantial fighting force. The Russians, who were officially without allies west of the Vistula, had passed into Germany without confidence, and it was uncertain from the fluctuations of Prussian diplomacy whether Frederick William III would exchange the alliance of Napoleon for that of Alexander. York, who had been responsible for the Convention of Tauroggen, was dismissed from his command and passed into East Prussia, where a patriotic insurrection was in progress. And for some weeks the King of Prussia was incapable of a choice between the two emperors. His inclinations carried him toward a policy of neutrality, and it was only an explosion of Prussian patriotism that imposed upon him a definite hostility to the empire. The Prussian temper, which now operated as the decisive factor in Central Europe, was the result of 6 years of French control. It had sprung without official encouragement from the humiliation which followed Jena, when national sentiment was outraged by a military occupation and material interests suffered from the confiscations of Daru and the pressure of the continental system. The collapse of Prussia had been followed almost immediately by patriotic reaction and a literary return to Germanic traditions. But the writings of Fichte and the subterranean operations of the Tugendbund were an ineffective expression of nationalism, and the exile of Stein in 1808 appeared to postpone indefinitely the work of national reorganization. But his administrative reforms had increased the efficiency of the Prussian government, and the more valuable work of Scharnhorst multiplied the value of the Prussian army. That force had been limited by Napoleon to a strength of 42,000 men, but Scharnhorst and his collaborators contrived by a system of short service to provide Prussia with a vastly greater supply of trained men. The patriotic cause suffered a severe loss by the death of Queen Louisa in 1810, but the work of reform was continued by Hardenberg, and the Prussian state was modernized by the gradual suppression of feudal privileges and the centralization of its government. Intellectual liberty found expression in the new University of Berlin, where the Prussian professor studiously avoided the cosmopolitanism of the French intellectuals, and a more practical form of education was developed by the formation of a staff college where Clausewitz lectured on the art of war. It resulted from the growth of this temper that Prussian patriotism was indisposed to acquiesce in the vacillations of its king between the French and Russian alliances, and it was significant of its antecedents that upon the same day the naturalist Stephens made a patriotic appeal to his pupils, and the Prussian government called for volunteers. The king was at Breslau in his customary indecision, but the course of the national movement cut short his hesitations. All exemptions from military service were cancelled, and within 3 weeks a treaty of alliance was signed with Russia, February 28, 1813. Alexander joined Frederick William at Breslau, and 2 days later the King of Prussia issued by proclamation the Appeal to My People. On the same day the Landwehr was created, and the decoration of the Iron Cross, which was a week old, was offered as the uniform reward of patriotic achievement. The Treaty of Alliance was elaborated in the Convention of Breslau, and the Russo-Prussian combination was complete. The first military results of the alliance were singularly successful. The Allies overran northern Germany, and whilst Berlin was recovered from the French, the line of the Elbe, which was the position adopted by the French defensive, was violated in 2 places. An insurrection in Hamburg was successfully supported by Russian cavalry, and a Prussian force seized Dresden. The emperor left France and prepared to restore the French control of Saxony. It was essential to the success of his campaign that he should operate without fear of an Austrian attack, and his diplomacy was directed to the captivation of Metternich. That minister declined to subordinate Austrian policy to Napoleon, but he had little sympathy with the national movement of Prussia, and finally adopted an unheroic and stationary position under the name of armed mediation. It resulted that the emperor was completely successful in the spring campaign. The Prussians were defeated at Lutzen by the French conscripts, and Dresden was recovered. The French continued their advance towards Silesia, and won a second victory at Bautzen. The emperor's rapid offensive brought his army to the line of the Oder, and when an armistice was concluded, Western Germany was in French hands. For a period of 10 weeks the campaign was interrupted by an interval of diplomacy. The emperor was confronted in Europe by the Sixth Coalition, and it was necessary for him to prevent the adhesion of Austria to that combination. The Austrian demands had been put before him by Metternich in a negotiation at Dresden, and included the abolition of the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, the withdrawal of French influence from the Confederation of the Rhine, and the surrender of Illyria. The emperor declined to abandon his Adriatic province, and prepared for war with Austria, which he endeavoured to isolate by an offer of Poland to the Tsar. But Alexander was loyal to Metternich, and Napoleon was driven to conduct a second unsuccessful negotiation at Dresden, in which the decisive interview took place too late, 24 hours after Austria had drawn nearer to the Allies in the Treaty of Reichenbach, July 28, 1813. On the expiration of the armistice, the emperor, who appreciated the strength of the combination opposed to him, acquiesced in Metternich's proposal of a congress, which met at Prague without gain to either side. When European diplomacy withdrew in the late summer, the Sixth Coalition was completed by the adhesion of Austria. The motives of the powers composing it exhibited the traditional divergences, but its military value in Central Europe was undiminished by the diversity of their objects. The Russians fought for Poland, the Prussians fought for Saxony, and the Swedes fought for the ambitions of Bernadotte. But their effort was directed equally against Napoleon. The English were distracted by a war with the United States, which had broken out in the previous year upon the question of neutral shipping, and their military energy was directed towards Spain, but they supported by every effort of diplomacy and finance the last and most successful of the coalitions. When the autumn campaign opened, the French positions in Saxony were threatened by the Prussians in Silesia and the Austrians in Bohemia. It was the design of the Allies to envelop the emperor in a ring of armies, which withdrew wherever he appeared and advanced wherever he did not. His advance into Silesia was arrested by a movement of the Austrians into Saxony. He returned and was completely victorious at Dresden, but his subordinates were almost uniformly unsuccessful. Oudinot at Grossbeeren, Vandamme at Kulm, MacDonald on the Katzbach, and Ney at Dennewitz achieved a series of reverses which restricted the emperor's movements and permitted the gradual concentration of the Allies in central Saxony. The Treaty of Teplitz regulated the reorganization of Germany, whilst the Allied armies operated a concentric march on Leipzig, which placed them in the third week of September upon 3 sides of the city. On the first day of the engagement, the emperor conducted a vigorous defensive on the southern front, whilst his generals were engaged upon the other sectors of the position. The effort of 130,000 men against 300,000 was inevitably unsuccessful. 2 days later he resumed without success the defence of a more restricted circle, and in the night the French marched westwards out of Leipzig. It was the retreat from Germany. The emperor moved by the line of the Main toward the French frontier, and the Allies failed at Hanau to intercept his retreat. 5 days later his armies reached French territory at Mainz, and within 7 weeks of the decisive Battle of Leipzig, the French were behind the Rhine, after a campaign in which the Napoleonic state system in Central Europe had ceased to exist. Westphalia, which had lost its entire army in Russia, collapsed before a raid of Russian cavalry. Holland and the Hanseatic departments outside the walls of Hamburg were held by the Allies, and Bavaria affirmed its desertion of the Empire by the employment of its troops against the French at Hanau. The loyalty of Saxony was reduced to the personal adherence of its king. It resulted from the support given by Russia and Austria to the Prussian national effort that the imperial system in Germany was reduced to the besieged garrisons of a few fortresses. France, the first nation in arms, had conquered Europe. Prussia, the second nation in arms, defeated France. In its final phase, the collapse of the French Empire took the form of an invasion of France. The area of French control had been reduced by the operations of the last year within the limits of French territory. Almost everywhere the French forces had receded behind its frontier. The armies which had imposed the Empire upon Central Europe were behind the Rhine. The armies which had imposed the Bonaparte monarchy on Spain were behind the Pyrenees, and only in Italy the command of Eugene conducted in advance of the French frontier a precarious defensive in the valley of the Po, threatened by an Austrian army and the treachery of Murat. The alliance of the military monarchies which had attempted an invasion in 1792 was reconstituted, but the Empire was less capable than the Revolution of defending its territory. An army of 80,000 men held the line of the Rhine, but the country behind them was almost completely exhausted. Its finances had been crippled by the overwhelming weight of taxation, and its active population had been steadily reduced by the drain of the conscriptions. The conscripts of 1815 were called up, and by an incredible effort France provided a new army of 300,000 men and a territorial force of 50,000. Confiscations and the emperor's treasure filled the financial gap, and the empire prepared for its last effort. End of section 27. Section 28 of the Partition of Europe by Philip Guedalla. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Book 3, Chapter 13, The Late Empire, Part 3. There intervened between the retreat from Germany and the decisive operations of the invasion a period of diplomacy. A negotiation was conducted at Frankfurt in which France was offered the natural frontiers of 1795. It was the design of the Allies that the Emperor should refuse these terms, and that the refusal should justify the invasion. Instead, he replied ambiguously and demanded a Congress. The Allies proclaimed his answer as a refusal and declared war. 24 hours later, the Emperor accepted the offer. His diplomacy had moved too slowly, and in a fortnight the invasion began. The French commanders made no attempt to hold the fortresses of the eastern frontier, and withdrew before the Allies. The Emperor, having appointed Marie-Louise a regent and Joseph lieutenant general, left Paris and assumed the command. He fell back from the Marne at Saint-Dizier and endeavoured to hold the line of the Aube against the combined armies of Blücher and Schwarzenberg. He was unsuccessful at the 2 engagements of Brienne and La Routière, and retreated behind the angle of the Seine. European diplomacy made once more an insincere appearance upon the scene at the Congress of Châtillon, February 4th to March 19th, 1814. When the Allies offered terms for the Emperor to refuse, and the Emperor negotiated for the benefit of French opinion. Meanwhile he conducted among the river valleys which led westwards upon Paris the most brilliant defensive campaign of his career. An injudicious movement of Blücher upon Paris by the line of the Marne exposed the Prussians, and in a manoeuvre of 5 days the Emperor drove them back in confusion at Champaubert, Montmirail, Château-Thierry, and Vauchamp. 4 days later he resumed his operations against the southern army of invasion, with success at Montereau. But the alliance was undisturbed, and upon the initiation of Castlereagh, England, Russia, Prussia, and Austria agreed to continue the war until the French power was expelled from Germany, Holland, Switzerland, and Spain, and reduced within the limits of its former frontiers. The Emperor now transferred his ubiquitous defensive northwards, and defended at Craonne and Laon the line of the Aisne. In his absence the Allies forced the line of the Aube and resumed the steady movement of the invasion. The Emperor hurried southwards from Rheims, and resumed the bewildering pattern of his movements between the Aube and the Marne. But it was gradually becoming obvious that brilliance of manoeuvre could not prolong indefinitely the resistance of 30,000 men to 300,000. The Allies had effected an overwhelming concentration on the Marne, and were now between the Emperor and Paris. He conducted a final manoeuvre in the rear of them on the upper Seine, and passed out of the theatre of war to Fontainebleau. The Allies arrived before the northern suburbs of the capital, and encountered considerable resistance from the command of Marmont and Mortier. But 24 hours later the armies of the military monarchies marched into Paris. March 31st. The Empire survived by a week the defeat of its armed forces. The Emperor at Fontainebleau contemplated a prolongation of the campaign behind the Loire, but the formation in Paris of a provisional government deprived his personal initiative of importance. The Allies were without any clear design for the future government of France. The Tsar was disposed to negotiate with representatives of the French people, and to approve whatever system they selected, and the Emperor of Austria would have been content with the regency of his daughter Marie Louise. But 2 factors combined to terminate the Empire and to restore the monarchy. Talleyrand, under whose presidency the first conversations were held, had developed a royalist bias after an unrivalled experience, and Metternich was convinced that it would be impossible to confine France within its former frontiers without a restoration of its former monarchy. This view was accepted by the Allies, and the disappearance of the Empire became the essential preliminary of peace. The legislature voted under the direction of Talleyrand in favour of a change of government, but the Emperor, who retained control of a considerable army to the south of Paris, was indisposed to acquiesce to his elimination. His commanders pressed him to surrender, but it was not until Marmont had compromised his military position by a treacherous movement of his troops that Napoleon consented to abdicate and resigned at Fontainebleau the thrones of France and Italy. On the same day, Louis XVIII was proclaimed King of France, April 6th. The settlement which was imposed on France by the Allied armies and the provisional government was contained in 3 documents and constituted a triple abdication. By the Treaty of Fontainebleau, the Emperor of the French abandoned his European position in exchange for the ludicrous Principality of Elba. It was the abdication of Napoleon. By the Convention of Calais, the Comte d'Artois, on behalf of his brother Louis XVIII, surrendered to the monarchies 53 fortresses, which were still held by French troops in advance of the French frontier. It was the abdication of the Revolution in its European aspect. By the Treaty of Paris, the French monarchy accepted from the powers of Europe the frontier of November 1st, 1792. It was the abdication of France. It had been the design of the monarchies to confine the French power within its original limits, and they were completely successful. the French government acquiesced in its exclusion from Germany, Italy, Belgium, Holland, and Switzerland in return for a modification of its southeastern frontier, and the Bourbon monarchy was restored to France at the price of ignoring 20 years of French conquest. The powers which had imposed this settlement were not disinterested in their activities, but with a single exception, the distribution of their rewards was postponed until the meeting of a European Congress. Great Britain alone, whose armies were conducting a successful campaign on the northern slope of the Pyrenees, was at liberty to receive its colonial gains without European debate. Within 7 weeks of Wellington's victory at Toulouse, Malta, Tobago, Santa Lucia, and the Mauritius became British territory. But the most substantial acquisitions were made at the expense of Holland by the annexation of Ceylon, the Cape of Good Hope, and the Dutch positions in western Guiana. It resulted that when the European debate began at the opening of the Congress of Vienna, British policy was satisfied with its acquisitions and disposed to discourage the dangerous activity by which Prussia sought to accelerate its annexation of Saxony. The British position was completed by the signature of peace with the United States, and the diplomatists at Vienna proceeded with the partition of Europe. Whilst Alexander and Nesselrode strove to perpetuate the Russian occupation of Poland, and Frederick William and Hardenberg endeavoured to secure Saxony, Talleyrand succeeded in obtaining for France a place in the European Session, and directed English and Austrian policy against the acquisitive powers of northeastern Europe. The demands of Russia and Prussia were modified by this combination, and the debate was proceeding placidly after a settlement of the Polish and Saxon questions, when it was interrupted by the return of Napoleon from Elba. The second reign of Napoleon, which lasted 100 days, was an episode of the Restoration. It was less a return of the empire to political reality than a military adventure. The French people had observed the return of the Bourbon monarchy without enthusiasm, but it had seen the departure of Napoleon with relief. Louis XVIII was an uninspiring figure, and his adherents formed an unenlightened and irritating caste. But his presence in Paris was a guarantee of peace. A constitution had been embodied in the Charte, and there was a genuine revival of political life. The army alone remembered the empire with any feeling approaching loyalty, and even in the army the higher officers had been content to accept office from Louis XVIII. But the emperor's flotilla succeeded in eluding the French and English patrol, and landed a force of 1,100 men between Cannes and Antibes, March 1st, 1815. This diminutive army of invasion marched on Paris by way of Grenoble and Lyon, and encountered no serious resistance. The population varied between apathy and local enthusiasm, and it was ridiculous to expect French troops to fire on Napoleon. 19 days later, the emperor reached Fontainebleau, and on the same evening he was in Paris. The action of the government had been paralyzed by a military conspiracy in the northern command, and Louis XVIII withdrew to Ghent. The emperor knew that it was only as the representative of the Revolution that he could hope to exclude the Bourbons from France, and he endeavoured to improvise a liberal empire. Carnot became Minister of the Interior, and Benjamin Constant assumed as constitutional adviser the work of modernizing the empire. By the Acte Additionnel it received a legislature of 2 houses, liberty of the press, and a mild degree of ministerial responsibility. The empire had endeavoured without conspicuous success to outbid the Charte of the monarchy. The new constitution was ratified by an unenthusiastic plébiscite, and accepted by the emperor in the elaborate ritual of the Champ de Mai. The new chamber was strongly opposed to the executive absolutism of the former empire, and Napoleon was confronted with the unaccustomed obstacle of a constitutional opposition. But the real problem of the restored empire was military. The monarchies had renewed the European coalition, and the French effort was again confronted with the armed forces of Europe. Whilst the armies of Russia and Austria moved slowly across Central Europe, England and Prussia had placed on Belgian territory, in proximity to the northern frontier of France, a force amounting with local troops to 250,000 men. The Emperor formed the Army of the North of 124,000 men, directed its concentration between the strong places of Maubeuge and Philippeville, and drove out of Paris to take command. The allied armies lay in two groups behind the Sambre: the British, whose communications ran westwards to the sea, covering Brussels, and the Prussians, whose communications ran eastwards to the Rhine, holding the line of the Meuse. It was the design of the Emperor to separate them by this division of interest, and to defeat them in turn. The attempt was made in a campaign of 4 days, and it did not succeed. The French passed the Sambre by 4 bridges in the neighbourhood of Charleroi, and wheeled to the right against the Prussians. On the following day the command of Blücher was attacked in position at Ligny. The French offensive was vigorous and successful, in spite of the unnecessary absence of d'Erlon's corps, and at sunset the Prussians withdrew. During the same hours the command of Ney had made an unsatisfactory attack on the English at Quatre-Bras. On the next day the Emperor transferred the weight of his offensive from right to left, and advanced against Wellington. The English withdrew to the position of Mont Saint-Jean across the Brussels road, and prepared to receive the French attack upon an inconspicuous ridge. Meanwhile the Prussians were in retreat from Ligny, moving northwards upon Wavre. The French cavalry failed to keep in touch with them, and its direction by Grouchy contributed to the Emperor's impression that Blücher had retreated eastwards upon Namur. Late in the morning of the 4th day of the campaign, the decisive engagement began near Waterloo, June 18th, 1815. The British, Dutch, and Belgian command of Wellington was of inferior quality, but it resisted for 6 hours a series of French attacks. In the afternoon the appearance of the Prussians from the east first accelerated and then arrested the French offensive. The Army of the North was destroyed, and ran for the French frontier. It was the last army of the Empire. The second reign of Napoleon ended with the destruction of his field army. Murat's attempt to raise Italy had ended with his flight to France, and the invading armies of Europe had passed the Rhine, the Alps, and the Gap of Belfort. The Emperor left the army and returned to Paris, which was controlled by the legislature. He was persuaded to abdicate and withdrew to Malmaison. For 4 days he remained in retirement, and once, by a singular return upon his career, he offered to the provisional government the services of General Bonaparte. The offer was refused, and he formed the design of retiring to America. At Rochefort he went on board a British cruiser, and became the prisoner of the Allied governments. He was transported to St. Helena. The adventure of the 100 days, which afforded to the Allies the luxury of a second entry into Paris, achieved no serious result. Napoleon was transferred from an island in the Mediterranean to an island in the Atlantic. The Bourbon monarchy returned in a more vindictive temper than it had exhibited at its first restoration, and the French frontier was drawn by the Second Treaty of Paris in a less favourable line than the frontier of 1814. It had been the Prussian design to avenge the Emperor's escapade by a partition of France, but England and Russia confined the punishment to a rectification of the frontier which deprived France of the fortresses of Philippeville, Saarbrück, and Landau, and exposed its territory to invasion by the lines of the Oise and the Saar. With the removal of the empire, the kings returned to their kingdoms. Russia, Prussia, and Austria resumed their normal territories, and the note of restoration which was characteristic of the Peace of Vienna was sustained in the return of Ferdinand VII to Spain and of Louis XVIII to France, and the effort of the European monarchies was expressed in the final act of the Congress of Vienna. It was the first object of that settlement, which effaced the Napoleonic reconstruction of Europe, to confine the French power within the limits of its new frontier, and to confront the French armies, wherever they violated it, with a strong defensive. On the northern frontier, the territory of Belgium was united with Holland in the single kingdom of the Netherlands. On the eastern frontier, the military power of Prussia was brought in contact with France by the acquisition of the Rhenish provinces, and the German defence of the Rhine frontier was consolidated by the organization of the Germanic Confederation. And on the Alpine frontier, the resistance of Piedmont was supported by the presence in North Italy of the Austrian power. France was deprived of every bridgehead which the Revolution had established beyond the Rhine, and its armies were excluded from Central Europe and the Italian plain by the secure establishment of Prussia and Austria. But the crusade against Napoleon had not been undertaken without hope of reward, and it was the second object of the monarchies to distribute Europe in a manner favourable to themselves. It had been the object of Russia to absorb the whole territory of Poland, and the Tsar had repeatedly insisted upon the purest doctrine of nationalism in opposition to a partition. But he was compelled to restore a large part of the Polish possessions of Prussia, and to endeavour, by the formation of the Holy Alliance, to supersede the settlement of Vienna. The reward of Prussia was more substantial. The restoration of its former territory, the absorption of an area of Saxony, and the acquisition of the Rhenish provinces increased the European importance of the kingdom, although its geographical conformation remained irrational and disjointed. The control of Central Europe was vested in the Germanic Confederation under the presidency of Austria. But it was significant that the expansion of Austria took a direction that led it away from Germany. Lombardy and Venetia became Austrian territory, whilst the Napoleonic reductions of Austrian territory in the Eastern Alps and on the Adriatic were annulled. The Habsburgs, who divided the control of Central Europe with the Hohenzollerns, had become an Italian power. Italy was redistributed amongst its princes, and Sweden alone of the minor powers owed to the influence of Bernadotte a substantial increase of territory by the union with Norway. There was one state in Europe which made gains by the Peace of Vienna, both within and beyond the continent. It was profoundly advantageous to Great Britain that French expansion should be checked, and that the coastline from Nieuport to the West Frisian Islands should be controlled by an independent government. England had made war in 1792 in order to exclude France from the Low Countries, and it made peace in 1815 with that object firmly secured. The territorial increase of Hanover was a compliment to its king, and the acquisition of Malta and Heligoland was an assistance to its sea power. But the greatest gains were made outside Europe. England obtained by the settlement of Vienna an extension of her colonial empire, which continued the transmarine development of the 18th century, and she was prepared to utilize that empire in an industrial and commercial effort which no power in Europe could rival. England had fought with the Revolution and Empire a war of 22 years, but she emerged from that war with her territory uninvaded and her sea power unimpaired. Of all the enemies of France, Great Britain was the strongest upon sea and the richest upon land, and it was fitting that when Napoleon sailed from Europe, he sailed in an English ship. The Empire had attempted, by the military effort of a decade, to impose upon Europe the Revolution, which required a century for its acceptance. The monarchies rejected it, and that rejection was expressed in the Peace of Vienna and in the order which sent Napoleon on a warship into the Atlantic. It was the end of an age. End of section 28. Read by Pamela Nagami, M.D., in Encino, California, January 2025. End of the Partition of Europe, a textbook of European history, 1715 to 1815, by Philip Guedalla.